The story of the Irish gangsters in New York starts not with strength, riches, or control, but with a deep need to escape a terrible situation. In the middle of the 1800s, huge groups of Irish people arriving in America flooded into the United States, running away from starvation, sickness, and a complete lack of hope caused by deep poverty in the country they came from. By the time they climbed down from the packed boats and stood on the wooden piers of Manhattan, lots of them had nothing with them except their family members and a small, flickering wish to stay alive. They discovered they were squeezed into disgusting, run-down apartment buildings in areas such as 5 Points and later a place called Hell's Kitchen. Neighborhoods that smelled strongly of garbage, sadness, and also a slim chance for something better. All mixed together, life for the Irish people in New York was extremely harsh and cruel. Jobs were hard to find. The pay for work was very small, and strong dislike for the new arrivals was powerful and angry. Newspapers called the Irish people drunks, lawbreakers, and people with low morals, adding to unfair treatment that blocked them from many good, honest jobs with very few choices. Young men started to form groups together just to make it through another day. These bunches began as disorganized gangs of neighborhood tough guys who battled enemy groups, took food by stealing it, and gave safety to the people living near them. But as time passed, these messy, rough groups changed into something much more serious and frightening. Hell's Kitchen, a tough part of Manhattan's West Side, turned into the birthplace of Irish gang life. It's small. Narrow roads and falling down apartments provided the perfect place for crime to grow. The piers on the Hudson River gave jobs to some people, but they also became the place for thieves, people running scams by the water, and tough guys who decided who could put cargo on and take cargo off the ships. Fighting and hurting people was a normal, everyday event. It was not strange for kids to grow up seeing bloody battles, pour out of bars, or for whole families to be scared of the next gang fight. In these first years, the Irish gangs were not clever, well-planned crime groups, but were instead street fighters marked by faithfulness to each other, cruelty, and the area they owned. Names like the Dead Rabbits, the Plug Ooglies, and the Wyos were shouted in the neighborhoods. Each gang had its own special way of dressing, its own weapons, and its own habits and rules. Their fights with enemies, including other immigrant gangs like the Italians and the Jews, colored the stone streets of New York red with blood. But under all the disorder was a type of system. The Irish gangs filled an empty space left because people did not trust the city's official groups. Police were often dishonest or clearly unfriendly to the Irish, leaving whole groups of people to take care of themselves. When a store owner in Hell's Kitchen needed safety, he did not call the police. He paid money to the local gang boss when a family required food. A gang might give it in return for faithfulness or doing a job. This situation made the line between being a criminal and helping the community fuzzy, making gang leaders people who caused both terror and also a strange kind of admiration. Politics soon got mixed up with this hidden world of crime. Irish immigrants, even though looked down upon, were large in number, and government officials saw their power in elections. Groups like Tammany Hall began to win over Irish gangs, offering jobs, helpful acts, and safety in exchange for getting votes on the day people choose leaders. Young Irish tough guys would fill voting boxes illegally, scare rival voters, or walk people to the voting place to make sure the chosen person won. In return, the gangs got power at City Hall, access to city work deals, and most importantly, safety from some police actions. This partnership between gangs and politicians was the first move toward the Irish Mobs changed into something bigger than just street fighters. Crime was not just about living through the night anymore. It became about ruling neighborhoods, changing elections, and gathering money and property. Leaders came forward who were more than just bullies. They were planners, people with big ideas, and tricksters who could think past the next battle. By the late 1800s, Hell's Kitchen had become another word for violence and bad behavior. Yet, it also created some of the first real gangsters of Irish background. These men understood that using only raw force could not keep their power going forever. They needed to change, to become more businesslike, to learn how to use the systems of power in New York for their own gain. Dishonesty became their best weapon. A payoff to a police captain could be worth more than many guns. A handshake with a government official could get safety for a whole gang. At the same time, the Irish gangsters began to move from street crime to money-making activities that brought in more cash. Gambling houses, bars, and places for illegal romance gave regular money. And the docks gave chances for threats to get money and stealing. Control of the waterfront became a main part of Irish power. Whoever ruled the piers controlled not just the movement of goods, but also the jobs of many dock workers, lots of whom were Irish themselves. Through fear and faithfulness, the gangs turned the waterfront into a strong castle of Irish rule. Still, the world of the Irish mob stayed violent and shaky. Gang wars exploded over territory, and partnerships changed as fast as money did. The streets of New York became battlegrounds where knives, clubs, and guns decided who was in charge. Families were sad for lost sons, while new leaders rose from the bloodshed. Each death, each win pushed the Irish mob closer to an identity that was more than just mess. Slowly, almost without people noticing, they were becoming a permanent part of the city, a regular thing you expected to see. For the kids growing up in Hell's Kitchen, the way forward was obvious. You either worked yourself to death for little pieces, or you joined the gangs and took your own piece of power by force. Many young men saw crime not as a decision, but as fate, a normal next step of the world around them. The Irish mob, even though still very young, was already molding generations of lives, making a culture of faithfulness, not talking, and a fierce wish to succeed. As the 1800s turned into the 1900s, the Irish mob stood at a point where it had to change direction. The disorder of the early gangs was being replaced by a more planned hidden world, one that would soon crash into the time of Prohibition, organized crime, and finally, the rise of the 5 big Italian families. But at the start, it was simple. A group of people pushed away by society, forced into just trying to live, and decided to grab power the only way they could. From these dark streets, the Irish mob would climb up, first as the rulers of Hell's Kitchen, and then as important people on the big criminal stage of New York City. At the start of the 1900s, the Irish gangs of New York began to change from spread-out street fighters into something more lasting. The poorer, crowded parts of Hell's Kitchen, still full of poverty and violence, had created hardened men who understood that just using force could only get them so far. If they wanted to do well in a city that was getting richer and stronger every day, they needed to become smarter lawbreakers. The waterfront stayed their biggest advantage every day. Many tons of goods moved through the Hudson River piers: grain, meat, coal, cloth, and later factory-made items that powered the city's money system. For the Irish gangs, the docks were not just a place to work. They were a kingdom. Dock workers, most of them Irish immigrants or their children, knew that their jobs depended on the gangs being happy with them. No cargo was loaded, no ship was unloaded, without the mob saying it was okay. Schemes to get money by threats grew well. A dock boss who wanted to avoid problems paid a fee, and a sailor wanting to protect his cargo slipped money to the right person. Those who said no often found themselves beaten, robbed, or even killed. Through this control, the Irish mob got both wealth and power in government. Politicians needed the working class vote, and the gangs got it for them in exchange for work deals, city jobs, and safety from the police. Tammany Hall, the Democratic political group that ran New York, counted heavily on Irish muscle. During elections, gangs scared voters, filled ballot boxes with fake votes, and made sure Tammany candidates won by huge amounts. In return, the gangsters were given jobs for supporters, papers allowing their bars and gambling houses to run, and most importantly, a wall against being taken to court. This relationship, where both sides needed each other, made the lines between politics and crime blurry. A local gang boss might have as much power as a city councilman, and in some neighborhoods even more. For Irish families living in Hell's Kitchen, the mob was part of everyday life, as normal as the church or the bar on the corner. A young boy might grow up watching his father vote, as told by the local gang leader, then go to the docks where mob enforcers decided who got paid that week. As the years went on, the Irish mob also made its illegal businesses bigger. Bars became not just places to drink, but centers for gambling, lending money at very high cost, and illegal romance. The gangs ran dice games in back rooms, collected debts with threats and violence, and took profits that kept them doing well. They controlled the bad parts of Manhattan, turning whole streets into their own private kingdoms. The police, often paid off or scared, did not look at what was happening. The Irish also created a rule less official than the Italian omerta, but not less strong. Faithfulness to the gang was most important, and turning on the gang was met with quick, often deadly punishment. To live in this world, you had to know when to talk and when to be quiet. Kids in Hell's Kitchen learned early that asking too many questions could get you hurt, and that some men had to be obeyed right away. Being silent became a way to stay alive. Violence, however, was never far away. Fights between gangs often blew up into bloody wars that frightened neighborhoods. The Wyos were replaced by new generations of gangs, each wanting more than the last. Leaders with charm and cleverness began to come up, people who understood how to balance cruelty with a plan. They knew that killing without thinking brought too much notice, but that sometimes one well-planned act of violence could secure an area or get rid of a problem. By the 1910s, the Irish mob was dug deep into the very insides of New York. They were no longer just bullies with knives and clubs. They were business people of crime, controlling worker unions, paying off officials, and running money-making operations. Their power spread beyond Hell's Kitchen to other neighborhoods, even reaching the Bronx and Brooklyn. They were cutting out an empire in the shadows of Manhattan's tall buildings. The city itself was changing fast. Immigrants from Italy, Eastern Europe, and other places poured in, making new fights and new chances. The Irish, once hated new people, were starting to move up in society. Some found real success as policemen, firemen, or politicians, while others joined the hidden world that had kept their families alive for many years. This double life, the good Irishman by day, the gangster by night, became a key part of the Irish mob's climb. Then came the first quiet talks of an event that would change everything: Prohibition. Talk of making alcohol against the law began to move across the United States, pushed by groups against drinking and people on moral missions. For the Irish mob, whose bars were already central to their power, This showed both a danger and a huge chance never seen before. If the country really made liquor illegal, who was better than the Irish to supply it? They had the bars, the contacts, the muscle, and the political support. What had once been a bad habit allowed in the dark could become a huge illegal market empire. The Irish mob stood at the edge of a new time. The gangs that had fought their way up from the apartments of Hell's Kitchen were about to find themselves in the middle of one of the most money-making crime businesses in American history. They were ready not just to fight in the streets, but to build an organization that could match anything New York had ever seen. When the 18th Amendment started in January of 1920, making the making, selling, and moving of alcoholic drinks against the law, much of America was thrown into confusion for many reformers and people on moral missions. Prohibition promised a clean society of bad habits and wrong actions. But in New York City, where taverns and bars were as common as churches, it was nothing less than an invitation to mess and opportunity. For the Irish mob, Prohibition was a present for many years. They had controlled bars across Manhattan, using them as hubs for gambling, illegal romance, and political planning. Now, with alcohol against the law, those same bars became doors to an underground empire. Almost suddenly, the Irish went from neighborhood crime bosses to big suppliers of one of the most wanted things in America. Liquor. The gangs moved fast. Illegal alcohol businesses appeared in Hell's Kitchen, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. Whiskey was snuck in from Canada. Rum was brought in from the Caribbean, and beer made at home flowed from secret breweries across the city. Irish gangsters learned to pay off customs officers, police captains, and even federal agents to keep the liquor moving without stopping. Their bars, now called speakeasies, worked behind locked doors needing special words and protection. From fancy places in Midtown to dirty bars hidden in basements, the Irish mob had a part in all of them. Violence grew as rival groups fought for control of the very profitable business. The Irish faced strong competition from Jewish and Italian gangs who also saw the huge profits to be made. Shootings in the streets became normal, and newspaper headlines yelled about gang murders that surprised regular people but did little to slow business. To the gangsters, every death was just another part of the plan, another step toward making their power solid. One of the most famous Irish bootleggers of the time was Oni Madden, a cruel gangster born in England to Irish parents and raised in Hell's Kitchen. Madden showed the change of the Irish mob during Prohibition. Known as the Killer, he had made his name by shooting enemies in the daytime. But during the 1920s, he changed himself into a businessperson of the hidden world. Madden controlled breweries, speakeasies, and gambling operations. And he was a master of paying people off, making sure his businesses were protected by both police and politicians. His power reached far beyond Hell's Kitchen, making him one of the most scared of and looked up to people in the city. Madden was not alone. Dozens of Irish gang leaders became important during Prohibition, each cutting out their own piece of the underground money system. Some controlled waterfront smuggling routes. Others ran groups of trucks that handed out liquor across the city. They used armies of enforcers who collected debts, scared competitors, and got rid of anyone who stood in the way. The very size of the operations turned what had been small-time gangs into very organized crime networks. The Irish were not only selling liquor, they were forming the culture of the Roaring Twenties. Jazz clubs, speakeasies, and dance halls grew under their protection. Night fun in New York became a sign of fighting against the strict laws, and the Irish mob was at its center. Politicians and famous people alike visited their places, drinking illegal cocktails while pretending not to see the gangsters in nice suits sitting in the dark. But with success came new tests, the Italians, who were quickly making their own power solid, looked at the Irish with both respect and anger. The Jewish gangs, also very wanting to succeed, often worked with the Irish in smuggling, but were just as quick to turn against them when profits were on the line. Partnerships formed and broke with dizzying speed, leaving a line of dead bodies behind them. Law enforcement, meanwhile, had a hard time keeping up. The police were full of dishonesty, many officers happily taking envelopes of cash to ignore bootlegging businesses. Federal agents, less easy to influence locally, started raids in court cases. But the huge size of the business made their work feel like a tiny drop in a big ocean. For every brewery they closed, 3 more opened for every gangster caught. Another took his place. Still, cracks began to show. Some Irish gangsters got too bold, showing off their wealth with expensive cars, jewelry, and big parties. This brought unwanted notice from the newspapers and the authorities. Others were hurt by betrayal inside their own groups, as wanting too much tore apart friendships and partnerships. The rule of silence was strong, but it was not unbreakable. Federal lawyers began to use these splits, turning low-level gangsters into helpers who could speak against their bosses. Yet, even with the risks, the Irish mob did well during the Prohibition years. Bootlegging made them rich beyond anything the people before them could have dreamed of. It also gave them the organization and control needed to live in the always changing world of organized crime. They were no longer just Hell's Kitchen tough guys. They were business people, politicians, and criminals all in one. By the end of the 1920s, the Irish mob had dug itself in as a permanent power in New York City. They controlled unions, the docks, bars, and the flow of illegal liquor. Their leaders ate with judges, changed elections, and decided the future of neighborhoods. Prohibition had turned them from gangsters into an empire. But as the 10 years came to an end, trouble was coming. The Great Depression was coming closer. Prohibition's days were counted. And new crime powers, especially the Italian Mafia, were getting stronger every day. The Irish mob, once the kings of New York's hidden world, would soon find their rule challenged like never before. The end of Prohibition in 1933 was supposed to mean a return to normal life in America. For reformers, it was admitting they failed. The dream of a nation that did not drink had fallen under the weight of dishonesty and lawbreaking. For regular people, it meant that the shadowy world of speakeasies and bootleg liquor would finally be replaced by legal bars and breweries. But for the Irish mob, who had built empires on the flow of illegal alcohol, it was both a victory and a terrible event. For more than 10 years, bootlegging had been the center of their wealth and power. Now, with alcohol legal again, the river of money almost dried up overnight. Speakeasies closed, breweries went legal, and the huge handing out systems that had kept the Irish at the top of New York's hidden world were suddenly no good. Some gangsters tried to change, turning their businesses toward gambling, lending money at high cost, and union crime schemes. Others would not accept reality, desperately holding on to bootlegging even as people stopped wanting it. The great days of the Irish mob seemed to disappear with the signing of a paper. The timing could not have been worse. The Great Depression had already thrown the city into deep sadness, leaving millions without jobs and hungry. Crime jumped as hopeless men turned to stealing and threats just to stay alive. For the Irish mob, the Depression was both a problem and a chance. On one side, the money crash made it harder to get money from neighborhoods already stretched to the limit. On the other side, unions became more important than ever, and the Irish, long in charge on the docks and in worker groups, saw a chance to hold on tighter, the waterfront became their lifeline. Control of the longshoremen's unions meant control of shipping, trade, and a steady flow of bribes and secret payments. Irish gangsters put themselves as labor leaders, showing a face of respectability while running crime schemes behind what people could see. They collected member fees, fixed hiring lists, and asked for payments from companies eager to avoid strikes or delays. For workers, faithfulness to the mob meant regular work. For the mob, it meant staying alive in a world that was changing fast. But they were no longer alone at the top. The Italians, once their rivals on the edges, had started to make their power solid. Men like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costo were creating a new style of organized crime, one based not just on raw force, but on structure, control, and working together. The famous five families came up, bringing a level of organization the Irish had never reached. The Italians had their commission, a ruling group that fixed fights and divided area. The Irish, instead, stayed broken up with bosses like Oni Madden and Vincent Mad Dog, Call running their own empires, but almost never joining together. Fighting was sure to happen. The Italians wanted the waterfront. The unions, the gambling crime schemes, all of it, and unlike the Irish, they had the numbers, the organization, and the long-term plan to take it. At first, there were shaky partnerships. Irish gangsters partnered with Italian bosses on some projects, splitting profits from gambling or smuggling. But trust was thin and betrayals were common. When arguments came up, they were settled not at talking tables, but in alleys and bars with guns and knives. One of the most violent people of this time was Vincent Mad Dog Call, an Irish gangster whose name became linked with mess. Call had once worked under Dutch Schultz, the Jewish bootlegging boss, but soon started his own thing. Not predictable and cruel, he fought wars against both Irish and Italian rivals, leaving a line of blood across New York. His kidnappings of rival gangsters for money surprised even tough criminals, and his careless shootings made him a target for law enforcement. Call's end in 1932, shot down in a phone booth by machine gun fire, showed the growing shakiness of the Irish mob. Where the Italians were building empires, the Irish were tearing themselves apart. Even people like Oni Madden, who had once seemed safe, began to fade. After serving prison time, Madden finally left the streets, moving to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he ran hotels and casinos. His leaving marked the end of a time. The Irish bosses who had ruled Prohibition were gone, and the new group lacked both their charm and their contacts. Meanwhile, the Italians pushed their advantage. Luciano's commission gave them a way to avoid wars that hurt themselves, while the Irish stayed divided and open to attack. By the late 1930s, the Irish mob was no longer the main power it had once been. They still controlled important crime schemes, especially on the docks, but they were more and more forced to share profits or give up area completely to the five families. For many Irish gangsters, the message was clear. The days of ruling New York's hidden world were finished. They could stay alive, even do well in certain small areas, but they would never again stand without a challenge. Instead, they became part of a bigger criminal world, one where the Italians held the top seat at the table and the Irish played smaller parts. Yet, even as their power became less, the Irish would not go away. They stayed stuck in the labor unions, the bars, and the neighborhoods of Hell's Kitchen. Their toughness, their name, and their history kept them going. And though the Italians might have ruled the city, the Irish would never fully give up. Their story was far from done. By the late 1930s, the Irish mob found itself standing at a place where a choice had to be made: The golden years of Prohibition were gone, and with them the huge wealth that had once made the Irish the kings of New York's hidden world. Yet, even with the drop, the Irish were not finished. In fact, they changed, focusing their power where it had always been strongest, the waterfront and the labor unions. The Hudson River docks stayed the beating heart of Irish influence. Every day, cargo ships came from around the world, carrying goods that kept the city's money system going. Whoever controlled the docks controlled not only trade, but also the jobs of thousands of longshoremen. The Irish, through unions like the International Longshoremen's Association, held that control with a very strong hand. Work on the piers was given not by skill, but by faithfulness. Men who paid money or promised to obey the mob were given regular jobs. Those who fought back were left to go hungry, not allowed to work on the waterfront at all. The system was known as the shape-up. Each morning, longshoremen gathered in big groups, hoping to be picked for a day's work. Gang-connected union bosses would walk the line, choosing who would be allowed to work. Piece of money into the right hand, or a favor owed to the right. Man often meant the difference between feeding a family and having no food. Through this system, the Irish mob kept total power, making the docks a fortress of dishonesty. The profits were huge. Companies paid secret money to avoid strikes or theft. Cargo strangely disappeared and came back on illegal markets. Insurance cheating grew, with shipments conveniently lost and claims paid out. Even the smallest deals, from unloading boxes to moving cargo, gave chances for threats to get money, and behind it all stood the Irish bosses, quietly getting rich while showing themselves as defenders of the working man. Politics stayed tightly twisted with this power. Tammany Hall still needed Irish gangs for muscle during elections. And in return, Irish gangsters enjoyed safety from being taken to court. Police captains, many of them Irish themselves, were more than willing to look the other way in exchange for envelopes filled with cash. Judges and city officials owed their jobs to votes brought by gang-connected neighborhood fixers, creating a circle of influence that kept the Irish dug in, even with the rise of the Italians. But the balance of power was moving. The Italian Mafia, with its 5 families and ruling commission, had become the main force in organized crime. Their structure and control gave them a togetherness the Irish did not have. Yet the Italians did not simply push the Irish aside. They saw the value of the Irish stronghold on the docks and unions, and instead of fight and all-out war, they looked for partnerships. In many cases, Irish gangsters acted as go-betweens, controlling the everyday work while paying a part of profits to Italian bosses who had the political and crime power to keep law enforcement away. This uneasy working together created both steadiness and strain. On the surface, the Irish and Italians worked together, dividing area and profits. Under the surface, bad feelings simmered. The Irish hated being treated as less important partners, while the Italians saw the Irish as stubborn leftovers from an earlier, less organized time. Arguments were frequent, and when talking failed, violence followed. Bodies were found floating in the Hudson or leaning against apartment walls in Hell's Kitchen. Quiet reminders that the Irish mob was not to be thought little of. The 1940s brought new tests. World War II changed the city, filling the docks with military cargo and creating new chances for theft and secret payments. The Irish mob made a lot of money, taking a little from government deals, sending supplies the wrong way, and threatening companies desperate to meet wartime needs. At the same time, the war gave the Mafia a chance to prove its faithfulness to the United States. Italian bosses like Lucky Luciano made deals with the government, offering to protect the docks from damage in exchange for less punishment. This made the Italians' influence even stronger, leaving the Irish more and more needing partnerships to keep their power. Still, the Irish kept going. In Hell's Kitchen, their name for toughness and faithfulness stayed unshaken. Young men growing up in the neighborhood still looked to the gangs as a way to respect and staying alive. The culture of silence made in generations of poverty and crime made sure that outsiders, including the police, rarely got into their world. For all the changes moving across New York, the Irish mob stayed a constant presence. Deeply stuck in the fabric of the city, by the end of the 1940s, the Irish had settled into a risky balance. They no longer ruled the hidden world as they once had, but they still controlled very important crime schemes, especially on the waterfront. Their connections to unions and politics kept them important, while their willingness to work with, and sometimes against, the Italians made sure they were never totally put aside. Yet, it was clear that the future belonged to the five families. The Irish were survivors. But survival meant accepting a smaller part. And in Hell's Kitchen, quiet talks began to move around about the next group. Young, careless Irish tough guys who were not happy to play second best. The seeds of future fighting were being planted. Seeds that would one day explode in violence as the Irish mob fought to take back the power it had lost. The years after World War II brought both success and unsureness to New York City. Soldiers came back home, the money system junked, and neighborhoods like Hell's Kitchen saw a new wave of life. Yet under the surface of this new start, the Irish mob struggled to hold on to its influence. The war had been good for business, filling the docks with cargo and putting money in the pockets of union bosses. But peace brought new pressures, and the Irish were slowly learning that survival in the after-war world would need more than muscle and old ways. The docks remained their strong place. Every box unloaded, every ship that entered the Hudson was a chance for profit. The shape-up system continued, and longshoremen still lined up each morning, hoping to be chosen for a day's work. Secret payments, threats to get money, and theft were as common as ever. And the Irish gangs got steady profits, but they were no longer the only power on the waterfront. The Italians had moved in quietly but firmly, making deals with shipping companies and putting their own men in union leadership. Where once the Irish had ruled alone, now they shared control. Often uneasily, with the five families, the Italians were organized in ways the Irish never fully matched. The commissions set up by Lucky Luciano in the 1930s kept the Italian families from fighting destructive wars against each other. Arguments were handled with a plan. Not mess, the Irish instead stayed broken. Each crew faithful to its own boss, partnerships moving with the wind. This lack of togetherness weakened them, leaving them open to Italian moves in. Even with this, the Irish stayed dangerous players. They were deeply woven into the fabric of city politics. Tammany Hall still leaned on them for votes and muscle, and police dishonesty made sure that many operations were not touched. Judges and lawyers often looked the other way, either bought or scared. For regular people in Hell's Kitchen, little had changed. The Irish mob was still the shadow government of the neighborhood, deciding who worked, who ate, and who suffered. The 1950s, however, brought a new enemy: federal notice. Up to this point, organized crime had done well largely because law enforcement at the city and state levels was not honest. But after World War II, as America entered a new time of success and world power, the federal government began to turn its look inside. Senators, newspaper writers, and investigators began to question the size of dishonesty in unions, politics, and business. And again, their investigations led back to the docks, to the unions, and to the mob. Televised meetings brought organized crime into the living rooms of regular Americans for the first time. Senators like Estes Kefauver questioned mobsters under bright lights, demanding answers they rarely gave. The Irish, long used to silence, would not work together, but their stone-faced fighting back only added to public interest. Suddenly, the Irish mob and their Italian partners were no longer invisible shadows. They were national people, signs of a criminal empire that stretched from New York to Chicago to Las Vegas. The pressure forced changes. Some Irish bosses tried to keep a low profile, going back into union politics or small-time crime schemes. Others doubled their efforts, believing that threats and violence would keep them safe. But violence brought notice, and notice brought the FBI. For the first time, the Irish were being hunted not just by rival gangs, but by federal agents determined to take apart organized crime. Still, the Irish kept going. Hell's Kitchen remained their fortress, a place outsiders rarely entered without permission. Their control of the streets, of the bars, and of the unions gave them strength. For young Irish men growing up in the 1950s, the mob was still a way to respect, to money, to an escape from poverty. They saw their fathers and uncles making deals with politicians, running crime schemes, and having power over the neighborhood. And many followed in their footsteps, but cracks were getting bigger. The Italians grew stronger each year, making their influence bigger, not just in New York, but across the country. They controlled casinos in Las Vegas, heroin pipelines from Europe, and clever gambling operations that were much bigger than anything the Irish ran. By comparison, the Irish seemed local, holding on to their docks and their neighborhoods while the Italians built empires. And yet, in their own way, the Irish stayed special. They were not held by the stiff levels of the Mafia. Their world was looser, more personal, built on neighborhood faithfulness and family ties. This gave them a kind of freedom, but also mess, without togetherness, without structure. The Irish could never fully test the five families, but they could make life difficult, bloody, and not predictable. By the end of the 1950s, the Irish mob was no longer the main force it had once been, but it was far from gone. They remained feared in Hell's Kitchen, looked up to on the docks, and dug in politics, yet the storm was building. Federal investigators were tightening their net. The Italians were growing ever more powerful, and a new generation of Irish gangsters, angrier, wanting more, and less controlled, was beginning to rise. The old group had survived wars, Prohibition, and the Depression. But the battles of the mid-20th century would be different. For the Irish mob, the question was no longer how to rule New York. It was how to stay alive in a city that was changing faster than they could control. The 1960s in New York were shaky years, a time of social change, political trouble, and deeper fighting on the streets. For the Irish mob, it was 10 years of change when the old world of neighborhood bosses and secret deals began to be replaced by a harder, bloodier generation of gangsters. Hell's Kitchen was still their home, but the character of the neighborhood was moving. Poverty, too many people, and waves of new immigrants created strain, and younger Irish men grew up with fewer chances than their fathers. For many, the mob was no longer about quiet deals with politicians. It was about raw staying alive. The old bosses who had ruled in the 1940s and 1950s were getting older, and while they still held influence in unions and on the docks, they struggled to change to the new climate. Federal investigations had gotten stronger. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had finally admitted the existence of organized crime after years of saying no, watching phone taps. and undercover operations began to break the curtain of secrecy that had long protected the mob. Italian families were the main targets, but the Irish could not escape notice, especially given their strong hold on the waterfront. Hell's Kitchen itself was changing. Once a close Irish area, it was becoming rougher, meaner, more hopeless. Young men who might once have found regular work on the docks or through union connections now faced a sadder reality. The shipping business was beginning to drop, and machines doing the work meant fewer jobs for longshoremen. For these young Irish, crime was not just a way to power. It was often the only way at all. These conditions gave rise to a new kind of Irish gangster. Unlike the people before them, who balanced cruelty with politics, this generation had little interest in giving in. They were shaped by the violence of the streets, the pressure of poverty, and the influence of heroin, which was beginning to flood New York, where the old group had counted on respect and connections. The new wave counted on fear. The Italians, meanwhile, were tightening their hold on the city. The five families controlled the heroin trade, ruled construction and trucking, and spread their influence into real businesses. To them, the Irish were useful friends on the docks and in Hell's Kitchen, but little more. The Irish, once equals in the hidden world, were more and more treated as second-level partners. This bad feeling added to anger among the younger generation, who felt no faithfulness to old partnerships. Street violence became common. Fights broke out in bars, alleys, and along the piers. The Irish youth formed small, close crews, often centered around childhood friendships and block faithfulness. These groups lacked the structure of the Mafia, but they made up for it in fierceness. They fought Italians, Puerto Ricans, and even each other, cutting out names with fists, knives, and guns. One of the key things of this new generation was its taking on of extreme violence. Stories moved around of young Irish tough guys who would beat men half to death for a late payment, who would cut faces in bar fights, who would shoot first and ask questions later. The old bosses shook their heads, seeing that this careless cruelty brought unwanted notice, but they could do little to stop it. Power was moving to the streets, to those willing to spill blood without stopping to think. At the same time, federal pressure grew stronger. High-profile meetings, phone taps, and catches shook the criminal hidden world. While the Italians took the worst of it, the Irish found themselves more and more open. Their ties to unions and politics, once sources of protection, now became problems as investigators looked deeper into dishonesty. Still, the Irish mob stayed strong. They controlled Hell's Kitchen with a very strong hand, and their name for violence kept rivals away. Their influence in the International Longshoremen's Association gave them regular money even as the docks dropped, and their willingness to act as enforcers for the Italians made sure that they stayed, important in the wider hidden world. But the seeds of future mess were already being planted. Among the young Irish, tough guys rising through the levels were men who would later become famous as the leaders of the Westies. They grew up in the shadows of the old mob, but said no to its careful ways. To them, violence was not just a tool, but a statement, a way of life. They would one day turn Hell's Kitchen into one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in New York's history. For now, in the 1960s, the Irish mob stood at a place where a choice had to be made. The old group still held on to power. The new generation made its knives sharp, and the Italians appeared larger than ever. The future of the Irish in New York would be decided not by deals in smoke-filled rooms, but by the cruelty of the streets and the willingness of young men to kill without stopping to think. The city was changing, and with it, the Irish mob would either change or be eaten up. The 1970s marked a cruel change for the Irish mob in New York. The old bosses, men who had once held power through unions, politics, and careful deals, were either dead, retired, or fading into being not important. In their place rose a new generation of Irish gangsters. Wild, not predictable, and without mercy. They were known simply as the Westies, and they would come to define the violent history of Hell's Kitchen for many years. The Westies were not a traditional crime family. They had no commission, no detailed levels, no deep respect for rules of secrecy. Instead, they were a tightly knit gang of Irish tough guys from the streets of Hell's Kitchen, held by childhood friendships, block faithfulness, and shared anger. They had grown up in poverty, surrounded by violence, and their way of thinking was simple: staying alive through fear. Their name for cruelty quickly set them apart. Where Italian mobsters often liked quiet threats, the Westies enjoyed open wildness. They chopped up enemies with meat cleavers, left bodies in garbage bins, and made horrible examples of anyone who crossed them. Their violence was not just a tool for business. It was their trademark. In a city filled with dangerous men, the Westies made even hardened mobsters shake. James Coonan came up as the natural leader of the crew, charming but cruel. Coonan understood both the street and the need for partnerships beyond it. Under his leadership, the Westies began to make solid control of Hell's Kitchen, driving out rivals and uniting the young Irish gangs under one bloody flag. Coonan's vision was not to remake the old Irish mob of the docks and unions, but to make something new, a gang that lived by violence, terror, and total faithfulness. The timing of their rise happened at the same time as a wider move in organized crime. The Italians still ruled the city, but they were facing increasing pressure from law enforcement. Phone taps, charges, and the RICO Act threatened their empires. For the Gambino family, then under the leadership of Carlo Gambino and later Paul Castellano, partnerships with outsiders became more valuable. The Westies, with their unmatched cruelty and control of Hell's Kitchen, were perfect friends. The partnership between the Westies and the Gambinos helped both sides. The Gambinos offered connections, protection, and chances in money-making crime schemes like lending money at high cost and gambling. In return, the Westies acted as enforcers, doing murders and threats too messy for the Italians to handle straight. For the Gambinos, it was like sending violence to someone else. For the Westies, it was a chance to make their influence bigger and earn real money. Hell's Kitchen under the Westies became a place of fear. Local bars, unions, and businesses all paid money to them. Not out of respect, but out of terror. Bartenders knew better than to say no to their demands. People who did not pay back loans often disappeared. Rivals were not just killed, but cut apart. The message was clear. Crossing the Westies meant not only death, but shame, being taken apart, and horror. The FBI began to take notice. The violence of the Westies was too public, too wild to ignore. Unlike the Italians, who tried to keep their killings quiet, the Westies often left behind horrible crime scenes that brought newspaper headlines. Investigators began to link them to a growing number of murders. But fear and silence in Hell's Kitchen made building cases hard. People who saw things rarely talked, and those who did often ended up dead. Drugs also became a part of the picture. Heroin and cocaine were spreading through New York, and while the Italians controlled most of the large-scale moving of drugs, the Westies made money from street-level selling in their neighborhood. This brought both money and mess, adding to further violence as drug users. Sellers and rivals all fought in the streets. Even with their wildness, or perhaps because of it, the Westies did well in the 1970s. They were not the business people that the Italians were. They lacked the smoothness and the long-term plan. But they didn't need it. Fear was their money. And in Hell's Kitchen, they were rich. Their partnership with the Gambinos gave them realness in the wider hidden world. And their rule of the neighborhood was total. Yet, this cruelty carried seeds of destruction. The very violence that made the Westies feared also made them open to attack. The FBI and NYPD began to see them as a major threat. And unlike the Italians, they had no political protection, no old partnerships with city officials to cover them. Their carelessness brought heat, and heat brought investigations. By the end of the 1970s, the Westies were firmly set as the face of the Irish mob in New York. They had replaced the careful, politically connected bosses of old with a new time of terror. They were friends of the Gambinos, masters of Hell's Kitchen, and signs of a cruel, unlimited kind of gangster life. But the very qualities that made them powerful would soon bring them to the edge of destruction. For in the years to come, the blood would flow thicker, the bodies would pile higher, and the fall of the Irish mob would be written in the violence of its own making. The 1980s were the blood-soaked highest point of the Westies' rule in Hell's Kitchen. Under James Coonan, the gang had grown from a loose collection of Irish street tough guys into a frightening criminal business. One whose name for cruelty made even hardened Italian mobsters stop and think. Their partnership with the Gambino family was stronger than ever, especially under Paul Castellano, who saw in the Westies the perfect tools of violence. But the same qualities that made the Westies useful to the Italians also made them dangerously unsteady. Hell's Kitchen in the 1980s was a place caught between old poverty and slow making the area fancier. The neighborhood's Irish heart was still strong, but cracks were appearing as real estate builders looked at the land and outsiders began to move in. For the Westies, these changes meant both chance and threat. They continued to control local bars, lending money at high cost, and gambling. But drugs were becoming a more central part of the business. Cocaine especially was spreading quickly. And while the Italians controlled the major pipelines, the Westies flooded their neighborhood with the drug. The money from drugs was amazing, but it came at a price. Drug use ate away at control within the crew, and fear of everything increased. Men who had once trusted each other like brothers began to suspect betrayal at every turn. Guns were pulled in arguments, and small fights grew into killings. Faithfulness, the bond that had once held the Westies together, was melting away in a cloud of cocaine and fear. James Coonan, though still the boss, found himself more and more under pressure. He had made the Westies feared, but he struggled to keep them under control. The very violence that had made his power solid was now spinning out of hand. The Gambinos, particularly Castellano, expected control and reliability from their friends. Instead, the Westies were becoming a problem. Too wild, too not predictable, too bloodthirsty. The gang's ways grew even more horrible. Taking bodies apart, long a Westies trademark, became disturbingly frequent. Enemies were chopped up in bathtubs, pushed into garbage bags, and thrown into the Hudson River. These acts of wildness spread terror through Hell's Kitchen, but they also brought the never-ending notice of law enforcement. Police and federal agents began to connect murder after murder to the Irish gang, and helpers whispered of cut-up bodies and bloody apartments. One of the most important people during this time was Mickey Featherstone, Coonan's right-hand man, a decorated Vietnam War veteran. Featherstone was both faithful and deadly, but he was also more and more unsteady, haunted by the war and driven by fear of everything. His shakiness made him both very useful and dangerous. Within the crew, partnerships moved and whispers of betrayal became constant. The FBI, meanwhile, made its focus stronger. The RICO Act, made to take apart organized crime, became the main weapon against the Westies. Federal agents knew that the Irish lacked the structure of the Italians, but they also knew that their cruelty made them especially open to attack. If they could turn even one insider, the whole house of cards might fall down. The Westies' relationship with the Gambinos also began to have strain. When Paul Castellano was killed in 1985, John Gotti rose to power in the Gambino family. Gotti was showy, planning, and less accepting of mess than the person before him. While he valued the Westies' muscle, he saw them as careless thugs. Their usefulness was fading, and their unchecked violence threatened to bring heat not just on themselves, but on their Italian partners. Inside Hell's Kitchen, fear ruled. Regular people living there knew better than to cross the Westies. Bars paid for protection. Businesses handed over envelopes, and anyone who fought back risked ending up in pieces. Yet, even as the gang ruled the neighborhood, their bases were rotting. Members turned on each other. Arguments were settled with bullets, and the FBI's net tightened. The seeds of betrayal were planted in these years. Fear of everything within the crew pushed some members toward working with law enforcement, while others simply looked for staying alive. The very faithfulness that had once defined the Irish gangs was gone, replaced by suspicion, wanting too much, and fear. By the end of the 1980s, the Westies were still feared, but cracks were impossible to ignore. Too many murders, too much blood, too much notice. The FBI was closing in, and the Italians were moving away. The Westies had reached the height of their power, but it was a highest point built on violence too wild to keep going. The fall was coming, and it would be as cruel as their rise. By the early 1990s, the Westies, once the unchallenged masters of Hell's Kitchen, were falling apart under the weight of their own violence and the never-ending pressure of law enforcement. The FBI, NYPD, and federal lawyers had spent the past 10 years carefully building cases, turning insiders, and mapping the detailed web of the gang's murders, threats to get money, and crime schemes. What had once been untouchable cruelty was now proof in courtrooms. James Coonan, once a legendary person of fear and power, found himself more and more alone. Years of cocaine use, fear of everything, and inside betrayal had worn away his control. Younger gang members, not wanting to wait, and made bold by the success of past violence, tested his authority. The faithfulness that had once defined the crew was broken, replaced by suspicion and fear. Every talk, every heel, every handshake carried the weight of possible disloyalty. Mickey Featherstone, Coonan's right-hand man, became a central person in the gang's downfall, haunted by his time in Vietnam and tortured by his own sense of right and wrong. Featherstone finally chose to work with the authorities. His speaking in court, along with that of other insiders, gave the federal government an unmatched window into the inside workings of the Westies. The stories were horrible. Murders done with cleavers, bodies taken apart and thrown into dumpsters, rival gangsters gotten rid of with cold, exact actions. Every detail painted a picture of a gang that had lost any appearance of holding back. The Gambino family, once friends and helpers, had already begun to move away. John Gotti's showy leadership brought increased media notice, which made the Westies' extreme violence a problem. The Italians valued muscle, but could not accept careless behavior that brought federal looking without their Italian partners covering them. The Irish gang was open to attack in ways they had never been before. Catches began to mount, police raids, phone taps, and undercover operations ended in trials that showed the pure cruelty and dishonesty of the Westies. Their rule over Hell's Kitchen, once total, came apart as the public learned of the scary murders, kidnappings, and threat schemes. That had kept the neighborhood under control for many years. The courts, for the first time, were able to get through the rule of silence that had protected them for so long. By the middle 1990s, the Westies were effectively taken apart. Leaders were found guilty on charges ranging from murder to crime schemes, and the younger members faced long prison sentences. Hell's Kitchen itself began to change as making the area fancier. Rebuilding and increased police presence pushed organized crime out of the public eye. The Irish mob, which had once been the same as the neighborhood, had lost not only its area, but also its mystery. Yet, the history of the Irish mob in New York could not be wiped away. For nearly 100 years, from the docks of the early 20th century to the blood-soaked streets of Hell's Kitchen, the Irish had shaped the hidden world with their violence, cleverness, and strong will. They had lived through Prohibition, the Great Depression, and waves of law enforcement pressure, leaving a mark on the city's history that was impossible to miss. The fall of the Westies marked the end of a time. What remained were stories, horrible, legendary, and often turned into myths, of a gang that had ruled through fear, fighting back, and cruelty. Their rise and fall was a proof of the shaky mix of poverty, chance, and violence that had defined Irish organized crime in New York for generations. By the 1990s, the Irish mob was no longer the force it had once been, replaced by law enforcement, making areas fancier, and the continued rule of the Italian Mafia. But for those who had lived through it, and for the historians who wrote about it, the memory of the Irish mob kept going, a story of power, blood, and the streets of Hell's Kitchen that would never be forgotten. As the 1970s happened, the Irish mob was no longer a single huge thing. Hell's Kitchen was broken into dozens of smaller crews, each controlling its own block or crime scheme. While James Coonan's Westies were in charge, their rise did not mean a peaceful making solid of power. Rival Irish gangs fought back. Fights broke out over territory, and long-running arguments became bloody shows. These smaller crews were often made up of young men who had grown up on the streets, made tough by poverty and the always present threat of violence. Many were veterans of small gang wars from the 1960s, while others were inspired by the tales of past Westies legends. They respected the old group, but tried to make themselves known, believing that the cruelty that had once made power solid could still be used to get territory and respect. Fights within the Irish community were frequent. A failed robbery, a personal insult, or a fight over a stolen shipment of drugs could start a violent payback. Unlike the Italian Mafia, which counted on structured talking through the commission, the Irish gangs had no central authority. This led to not predictable increases. Bar fights could turn into stabbings, street fights into public killings, and rivalries often ended with bodies thrown in dumpsters or left on the piers. At the same time, partnerships with the Italians became more and more based on a plan. The Westies needed the Gambino family for protection and access to money-making crime schemes beyond their neighborhood. The Italians, in turn, used the Irish as enforcers, men willing to do cruel acts that were too messy for the Mafia's more controlled image. These partnerships were about business, fragile, and dependent on shared profit rather than trust. A betrayal or failure could end in murder, and often did. Drug moving became a growing source of fighting. While the Italians controlled major supply chains, the Irish handed out drugs at the street level in Hell's Kitchen. This gave huge profits, but also brought unwanted notice from law enforcement. Drug-fueled violence increased as drug-addicted crew members became not predictable and fights over area grew. It was a dangerous balancing act. Money flowed, but mess followed. Within the Westies, control was a constant test. Leaders like James Coonan and Featherstone kept authority through fear, yet the younger, more careless members tested limits. Inside murders were common. Even trusted second-in-commands could be killed on suspicion of betrayal. Faithfulness was demanded, and suspicion was constant. In a world run by knives, cleavers, and guns, fear was the glue that held the gang together. Even with this shakiness, the Westies made their influence bigger. They made solid control over local bars, unionized labor, illegal gambling, and street-level drug handing out. Their partnership with the Gambino family let them reach out beyond Hell's Kitchen, getting access to crime schemes in Manhattan and parts of the Bronx. Yet every making bigger carried risk. Law enforcement was making investigations stronger, and the FBI began connecting different murders, slowly putting together the network of Irish criminal activity. By the end of the 1970s, the Irish mob in Hell's Kitchen was both more powerful and more open to attack than ever. The Westies had reached being in charge, but they're counting on extreme violence and shaky partnerships made the gang a target for both law enforcement and rival organizations. Inside fights, the pull of drugs, and the not predictable mood of young gangsters all threatened the fragile balance. The 1980s would test the Westies like never before. Their cruelty, which had made their power solid, would now bring never-before-seen federal notice. And as the 10 years moved forward, betrayals from within would unravel the empire they had spent many years building. The 1980s made the violence in Hell's Kitchen higher to never-before-seen levels. The Westies, under James Coonan and his second-in-commands, did cruel raids not only against rival Irish gangs, but also against anyone who threatened their control. The streets became a theater of terror, where a good name was made solid with blood and faithfulness was measured in staying alive. Murder was both business and message. Rival crews, people who owed money, and traitors were killed with extreme cruelty. Cleavers, axes, and guns were standard tools, and the Westies made a frightening name that even experienced Italian mobsters looked up to. Bodies were found taken apart, often left as warnings. Public shows of violence were meant to send a single message: crossing the Westies was deadly. The murder of Paul Castellano in 1985 moved the hidden world scene. John Gotti's rise to power in the Gambino family changed the dynamics between the Italians and the Irish. Gotti admired the cruelty of the Westies, but demanded more control and responsibility. While the partnership continued, strains grew. The Italians wanted results, not shocking bloodshed that would bring federal looking, for the Westies controlling. Hell's Kitchen on their terms stayed most important, and giving in was rarely accepted. Inside rivalries within the Westies got worse during this time. Mickey Featherstone, once faithful, began to break under pressure from law enforcement and personal demons. Including his struggles with PTSD from Vietnam, other members fought for position, leading to inside killings and a growing fear of everything within the group. This unsteadiness made the Westies more and more needing their ties to the Gambinos for support and protection. Even as the Italians grew wary of their not being predictable, the FBI made efforts stronger in the late 1980s. Task forces were set up to watch murders, threats to get money, and drug handing out. The violent nature of the Westies made investigation both easier and more complicated. Their extreme actions left trails of proof, yet their rule of silence and street fear made people who saw things scarce. Federal agents began growing helpers within the gang, carefully moving through the dangerous faithfulness that had kept the Westies untouchable for many years. Some members of the gang, tempted by less punishment or forced by proof, began to work with the authorities. Their speaking in court gave detailed stories of murders, kidnappings, and the inside workings of the crew. The tailies were frightening. Killings in bathtubs, cruel payback against rivals, and the planned getting rid of anyone seen as a threat. These confessions showed not only the size of Westies' violence, but also the gang's counting on fear as a management tool. Even with federal pressure, the Westies continued to work. They made control bigger over local gambling, labor unions, and street-level drug markets. They worked with the Gambinos on larger-scale operations, using their muscle to make debt collection happen and scare competitors. Yet the shadow of law enforcement hung larger than ever. Every raid, every murder, and every threat scheme now carried the risk of federal charges. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the Westies' rule was coming near a turning point. Their partnership with the Gambino family was both a lifeline and a problem. Inside unsteadiness threatened to undo them from within, and federal investigations were tightening the rope. For the first time, it became possible to imagine a world in which Hell's Kitchen would no longer be ruled by Irish terror. The 10 years closed with a feeling that the Westies' empire, built on fear and cruelty, could not last forever. The seeds of betrayal, mixed with never-ending law, enforcement pressure, and the changing social scene, were setting the stage for their final collapse. The early 1990s marked the beginning of the end for the Westies. Federal investigations, which had been gathering speed throughout the 1980s, finally gave results. Undercover agents, phone taps, and carefully grown helpers began to show the inside workings of the gang, the pure cruelty of the Westies. Once their greatest strength, now became their downfall. Each horrible murder, each act of threat, left traces that law enforcement could follow. James Coonan, the gang's charming leader, found himself more and more alone. His authority, once total, was tested by ambitious younger members and by the never-ending pressure of federal lawyers. Inside fear of everything got stronger. Members suspected each other of betrayal, often with deadly results. The very fear that had once united the Westies began to unravel them from within. Mickey Featherstone, haunted by his past and under huge legal pressure, became a key person in the gang's collapse. After years of faithfulness and violence, he agreed to work with federal authorities. His speaking in court gave never-before-seen understanding into the Westies' operations. Murders done with cleavers, bodies taken apart and thrown away. Threatways that had terrorized Hell's Kitchen for many years. For the first time, law enforcement had a clear map of the gang's levels and ways. The RICO Act became the government's most powerful weapon. Made to take to court organized crime completely, it let lawyers connect single crimes into a wider pattern of criminal business. Westies' leaders faced charges that joined many years of violence, threats to get money, and crime schemes into single charges. The trials were dramatic, highlighting the scope of the gang's power and the extreme nature of their crimes. The Westies' partnership with the Gambino family also became a double-edged sword. Helpers began giving details not only about Irish operations, but also about their Italian partners. John Gotti, then head of the Gambinos, found his empire indirectly shown through the working together of Irish witnesses, while the Gambinos had allowed the Westies' wildness when it served their interests. The rise of federal looking now threatened both groups. In Hell's Kitchen, the feeling moved. The streets that had once been firmly under Irish control grew quieter, more watched. Bars, taverns, and small businesses that had paid money no longer faced the same threats. The fear that had kept the Westies' power going faded as federal agents and police presence increased. For people living there, the neighborhood began to change, signaling the drop of the Irish stronghold that had ruled for many years. Catches of key Westies members were fast and decisive. Leaders were charged on multiple counts, many facing life in prison, the gangs inside holding together. already weakened by fear of everything and drug abuse, collapsed further under the weight of legal pressure. Helpers and people who left turned the gang's own violence into proof against them, sealing the fate of a criminal business that had once ruled Hell's Kitchen with terror. The early 1990s showed that no level of cruelty or fear could protect the Irish mob from the changing power of federal law enforcement. The mix of RICO court cases, helpers speaking in court, and never-ending investigation systematically took apart the Westies. Their rule over Hell's Kitchen, once total, was over. Yet the history of the Westies and the Irish mob, more broadly stayed, cut into the neighborhood and the history of organized crime in New York. The violence, partnerships, and boldness that had defined their rise also shaped the story of their fall, showing the risky balance between power and self-destruction in the criminal hidden world. By the middle 1990s, the Irish mob in New York had been effectively made neutral as an organized force. What remained were pieces of crews, stories of terror, and a history of violence that would teach law enforcement ways and criminal myths for years to come. By the middle 1990s, the court system had fully turned its focus on the leftovers of the Westies. Trials were large and very public, showing the gang's violent ways and criminal business to the world. Lawyers used the full power of the RICO Act, connecting many years of murders, threats to get money, kidnappings, and crime schemes into complete cases against the Irish mob. Key people like James Coonan and Mickey Featherstone faced life-changing results. Coonan, once feared for his cruelty and charm, found himself alone in court, his name reduced to a list of crimes carefully written down by investigators. Featherstone's working together proved key, giving detailed stories of murders, cleaver attacks, and inside power fights. His speaking in court not only told the mechanics of the gang, but also highlighted the mind climate that had allowed such violence to grow. Inside betrayal had been growing long before the trials. Fear of everything in fear, fueled by many years of bloodshed and drug use, made faithfulness more and more fragile. Members who had once been friends in arms turned against each other in exchange for less punishment or shorter sentences. These leaving gave lawyers with direct proof, speeding up guilty findings and taking apart the gang's levels. The trials showed the full scope of the Westies' operations. Murders were done with planned cruelty, often to send messages to rivals or make faithfulness within the crew happen. Threats to get money and protection crime schemes had gotten into bars, eating places, unions, and small businesses throughout Hell's Kitchen. Kidnappings and threats had become tools to keep rule. The proof painted a dark picture of a gang that had done well on fear and violence for many years. Sentences were severe. Leaders got life in prison, while mid-level members faced long terms, effectively taking apart the gang's working structure. The once feared enforcers of Hell's Kitchen were now behind bars, their power made neutral by the very system they had long avoided. The trials also served as a warning to other criminal businesses. Extreme violence and careless behavior, no matter how effective on the streets, could no longer protect one from federal looking. The fall of the Westies reshaped Hell's Kitchen. The streets, once ruled by Irish gangs, became quieter and more watched. Law enforcement presence increased and neighborhood dynamics began to move, making the area fancier, which had been a slow but continuing force. Sped up without organized crime, new people living there and businesses moved in, slowly wiping away the old Irish stronghold, both physically and in culture. Yet the history of the Westies stayed. Stories of their violence and boldness continued to move around, influencing media pictures of organized crime and the public's imagination. Their rise and fall showed the delicate balance between raw cruelty and power that can keep going. While their ways had made rule solid for many years, the sane counting on extreme violence finally planted the seeds of their destruction. The collapse of the Westies also had meanings for the Gambino family and the wider hidden world. The Italians, who had once used the Irish as enforcers, became more careful in their partnerships. The federal government, made bold by the successful court cases, continued to use RICO and witness working together to take apart organized crime networks, the Irish mob. Once a big force in New York was effectively made neutral, leaving the Italian families to rule organized crime in the city. For Hell's Kitchen, the fall of the Westies marked the end of a time. The neighborhood changed from an area of fear into a community more and more defined by rebuilding, making the area fancier and law enforcement watching. The streets that had been the stage for many years of cruelty became quieter, but the stories of the Irish mob's rule stayed, made to live forever in local stories and criminal history. By the late 1990s, the Irish mob no longer held power in New York. Its leaders were in prison, its structures taken apart, and its operations taken apart. What remained was a historical history of violence, fear, and staying alive. A warning story of how a gang, no matter how feared, can be undone by its own too much and the never-ending chase of justice. Even after their drop, the Irish mob left a mark that cannot be removed on New York City. Hell's Kitchen, once a fiercely controlled Irish area, bore the marks of many years of organized crime, and the gang's influence reached far beyond the neighborhood. Politically, the Irish mob had long been twisted with local power structures, particularly Tammany Hall and Union leadership, even as their criminal rule became less. The echoes of these connections continued to shape the city's political scene. Union politics, especially on the waterfront, had been one of the Irish mob's main sources of power. The mob's historical control over labor made sure not only money influence, but also political power, even in the 1990s. The memory of many years of dishonesty, threats, and manipulation stayed, reminding city officials and labor leaders of the results of unchecked criminal involvement. This history influenced new generations of politicians who came to labor talks and city deals with care, often remembering the Irish mob's strong reach. Culturally, the Irish mob became a sign of the darker side of New York's working-class history. Their stories went through books, film, and television. Movies and books showed Hell's Kitchen as a place where violence and staying alive were tested, shaped by gangs that joined street faithfulness, cruelty, and cleverness. The Westies, in particular, became a perfect example of the specially ruthless, hands-on style of organized crime. Different from the more formal Italian Mafia, their ways, colorful characters, and extreme violence left a lasting impression on the picture of Irish gangsters in popular media. Even within the criminal hidden world, the Irish mob's history continued. While the Westies were taken apart, the idea of neighborhood-based, tightly knit, cruelly effective gangs continued to influence other groups. Young lawbreakers in Hell's Kitchen and beyond studied the history of the Westies, learning from their boldness, their plans, and just as importantly, their mistakes. The lessons were clear. Power could be taken through terror, but staying alive needed control, secrecy, and care, qualities the Irish often lacked in their final years. The physical change of Hell's Kitchen also reflected the mob's fading influence. As making the area fancier moved forward, old mob meeting places, bars, and taverns were replaced with fancy eating places, apartments, and businesses. Yet, under the new fronts, the stories of Irish gang rule stayed, Locals and historians alike told tales of horrible murders, violent area wars, and the strong hold the Westies had kept. Paintings on walls, books, and shows kept the memory of a neighborhood once ruled by fear. The Irish mob story also offered wider lessons about organized crime in America. Their rise showed the meeting point of poverty, ethnic togetherness, and chance. Their drop showed the results of extreme violence, poor inside control, and the increasing reach of federal law enforcement. The Westies working together with the Gambino family showed how cross-ethnic partnerships could give power, but also how fragile those partnerships could be under pressure. By the late 1990s, the Irish mob was no longer a touchable force, but its history was stuck in New York's cultural and criminal fabric. Law enforcement continued to study their ways. Politicians remembered the entanglements, and storytellers took ideas from the dramatic rise and fall of a gang that had ruled with cruelty and cleverness. Hell's Kitchen itself had changed, but the shadow of the Irish mob stayed, a reminder of a neighborhood and a criminal world that had once been inseparable. In the end, the Irish mob of New York became more than just a criminal organization. They were a sign of strength, violence, and the complications of immigrant life in the city, their story. From the early days on the docks to the rule of terror in Hell's Kitchen, offered a window into the human ability for wanting to succeed, faithfulness, and destruction. And while the streets they once controlled had changed forever, the memory of their rule stayed cut into the city's history, made to live forever in blood, fear, and story. The story of the Westies cannot be told without looking at the men who defined the gang. At the center stood James Coonan, a man whose charm, cleverness, and violence made him both looked up to and feared. Coonan's growing up in Hell's Kitchen had been filled with poverty, community faithfulness, and the always-present reality of street violence. These early experiences shaped a way of seeing the world in which power was to be taken by force. Respect demanded obeying, and betrayal was punished without pity. Coonan's leadership style was a complicated mix of charm and terror. To his faithful followers, he was a protecting person, capable of being generous and thinking with a plan. To rivals and those who crossed him, he was without mercy, often planning killings with cruel style in the mind. Coonan showed the two sides of the Westies, a need for control and faithfulness, made less severe by sudden violence that sometimes hurt his own authority. His ability to bring fear was matched only by his need to claim being in charge constantly, which would later add to breaks within the gang. Mickey Featherstone, Coonan's right-hand man, presented another side of the leadership picture. A decorated Vietnam War veteran, Featherstone was both controlled and unsteady, haunted by war experiences and driven by faithfulness to his friends and gang. He moved between planned thinking and sudden violence. His actions, while often effective, brought not being predictable into the gang's operations. Featherstone's final decision to work with law enforcement highlighted the scene. Fragility of faithfulness under the pressures of fear, drugs, and the legal system, other second-in-commands and enforcers added to the gang's shared identity. Men like Tommy the Irishman Carrion, who did very well in street-level threats and enforcement, showed the tactical side of the Westies' operations. Yet even skilled members were likely to sudden decisions fueled by alcohol, drugs, or personal long-running arguments. This shakiness defined the Westies, a gang capable of careful planning, yet equally likely to explode into mess. Personal relationships within the gang were central to its holding together and final unraveling. Bonds made in childhood, schoolyards, and local bars were twisted with business and violence. Marriages, friendships, and romantic involvements often met with criminal life, creating situations where faithfulness and personal feelings could crash terribly. Coonan's own charm let him settle fights, but as fear of everything and wanting to succeed grew, these relationships became strained, adding to inside mistrust and final betrayal. The leadership mind of the Westies reflected a blend of wanting to succeed, feeling insecure, and the need for recognition. Members looked for not just money, but respect, status, and staying alive in a world where weakness could be deadly. Decisions were made under the double pressures of keeping street rule and pleasing Italian friends, leading to a constant strain between strategic holding back and careless cruelty. The mind weight of this environment shaped every action from murder to talking and told the gang's final path. Understanding these personal dynamics is key to understanding the Westies' rise and fall. Their successes were often the result of courage, faithfulness, and boldness, while their downfall was made faster by fear of everything, sudden action, and inside breaks. Leadership was both a uniting force and a possible source of collapse, as the mix of fear, wanting to succeed, and personal fighting created a shaky, unsustainable environment. The story of the Westies leaders shows a wider truth about organized crime. It is as much about human mind as it is about money, territory, or violence. The wanting to succeed, faithfulness, and unsteadiness of single members shaped the path of the whole gang. Hell's Kitchen became a stage where personal dynamics played out on a public, often horrible scale, by looking at the reasons, fears, and personalities of key people. One can see how the Westies' extraordinary rise was mirrored by an equally dramatic fall, leaving a history defined by both human complication and pure cruelty. The middle 1980s were a shaky time for the Westies, marked not by outside threats, but by the growing unsteadiness within the gang itself. What had once been a tightly knit group held by childhood, friendships, and neighborhood faithfulness began to break under the pressures of power, drugs, and wanting too much inside fights, often started by small insults or arguments over territory, grew into violent meetings that made the organization unsteady from within. One of the most important sources of inside fighting was the struggle for control over money-making crime schemes. While James Coonan kept his position as leader, younger members grew not wanting to wait, looking for larger shares of profits from gambling, threats to get money, and drug handing out. These strains were made worse by the increasing wealth that flowed through Hell's Kitchen in the cocaine boom, where street-level operations brought both chance and competition. Money that had once been shared, according to faithfulness, was now a source of bad feeling and rivalry. Drug use within the gang made these strains bigger. Many members addicted to cocaine or other substances became not predictable and sudden. Decisions that had once been planned were now clouded by fear of everything and damaged thinking. Small arguments could explode into deadly fights. As personal bad feelings twisted with business arguments, members who had before been trusted enforcers now posed threats to both their friends and the gang's overall steadiness. Murders within the gang increased during this time, often aiming at those suspected of betrayal or not obeying. Killings were sometimes done publicly, sending clear messages to others. But these acts also created fear and mistrust inside. Mickey Featherstone's role became more and more complicated as his faithfulness to Coonan fought with his own staying alive instincts and moral unsureness. His growing worry mirrored the wider unsteadiness that held the Westies. Even the most controlled members were beginning to question the gang's holding together and future. Praying wanting to succeed also fueled inside fighting. Ambitious second-in-commands and enforcers saw chances to rise in rank, often at the cost of friends. Murders and threats became tools not just for outside rule, but for inside positioning. This environment of suspicion meant that partnerships were constantly moving, and no member was completely safe from suspicion or deadly payback. The gang's relationship with the Gambino family added another layer of pressure. While the Italians gave protection and chances, they also demanded control and results. Failures or careless behavior could put the partnership in danger, and some members felt anger at the watching or interference. These strains between keeping street independence and satisfying the Italians' expectations added to the inside fights that would later weaken the Westies. By the late 1980s, the total effect of these inside fights became clear. The Westies, once feared for their togetherness and fierceness, were now open to attack from within. Betrayals, sudden violence, and broken faithfulness wore away the gangs holding together. Leaders faced constant tests to their authority, and the network of fear that had once controlled Hell's Kitchen began to unravel. These inside breaks were a key factor in the gang's final downfall. While law enforcement played a decisive part, the unsteadiness created by inside fights, drug abuse, and wanting to succeed made the Westies more open to court cases and leaving. The very cruelty and fear of everything that had made their power solid now made their collapse faster. The middle 1980s marked a turning point. The Westies' rule of Hell's Kitchen was no longer sure. The gang's inside mess, mixed with increasing pressure from law enforcement and the Gambino family, set the stage for Catch's Helpers, and the final taking apart of one of New York's most violent Irish gangs. The seeds of their destruction were planted from within, showing that in the world of organized crime, inside betrayal can be as deadly as any outside enemy. As the 1980s came to an end, the Westies faced a threat more sneaky than rival gangs or Italian watching. Betrayal from within, years of never-ending violence, drugs, and fear had broken the once tightly knit crew. Faithfulness, the base of their power, began to crack under the pressures of self-protection and legal showing. The stage was set for a series of leadings that would finally take apart the gang. Mickey Featherstone, once James Coonan's right-hand man and a sign of never-changing faithfulness, became the first high-profile person who left, haunted by his experiences in Vietnam and tortured by the weight of his crimes. He began working with federal authorities in exchange for less punishment. Featherstone's insider knowledge was amazing. Detailed stories of murders, threatways, threat schemes, and even the gangs working together with the Gambino family. His speaking in court gave the FBI a never-before-seen window into a criminal network that had long worked without punishment. Featherstone's working together made others bold, street-level members, fearful of court cases or driven by money rewards, began to give more information. This wave of helpers broke the rule of silence that had protected the Westies for many years. Names, places, ways, and rivalries all were laid open to law enforcement, wearing away the gang's working safety. The very fear that had once united Hell's Kitchen now made members not trust one another. Making inside collapse faster, the FBI used these leavings with a plan. Agents used recorded talks, watching, and backed up speaking in court to build very strong cases under the RICO Act. Every murder, threat payment, and act of violence was linked into a wider pattern of organized crime, letting lawyers charge multiple members at the same time. The legal net tightened, and for the first time, the Westies' rule of Hell's Kitchen faced a threat to its existence from the court system. Inside strains grew as news of leaving spread. Members feared they would be next to be involved, resulting in acting first acts of violence. Some were gotten rid of because of suspicion, while others looked for protection from law enforcement themselves. This circle of fear and betrayal made the gang more unsteady, wearing away the togetherness that had been its greatest strength. Hell's Kitchen, once a territory of very strong control, became a scene of unsureness, where even faithful members questioned the steadiness of the organization. The partnership with the Gambino family, long a source of strength, became strained under these pressures. Italian leaders were wary of the Westies, growing not being predictable, and the increased federal looking that followed from high-profile leavings. While some working together continued, the relationship was no longer as mutually helpful as it had once been. The Irish gang's carelessness and inside unsteadiness now posed risks to their Italian partners, further isolating the Westies. By the early 1990s, the combined effect of betrayal, legal pressure, and inside mistrust had irreversibly weakened the Westies. Catches, charges, and guilty findings became more frequent, and the once feared gang was now fighting a battle on many fronts. Staying alive law enforcement, moving through broken inside faithfulness, and keeping the leftovers of their area control. Each leaving and working together with the FB, I made the drop faster, showing that even the most ruthless gang could be undone from within. The first wave of helpers set an example for others. As members saw the benefits of working together, reduced sentences, protection, or even safety, they began to weigh self-protection against faithfulness. The Westies' culture of fear, which had once made sure obeying, now grew fear of everything, suspicion, and betrayals when the chance came. What had been their strength became the way of their unraveling. By the middle 1990s, the first major trials were happening. Featherstone speaking in court, along with that of other working together members, formed the backbone of the lawyer's case. Hell's Kitchen, the neighborhood that had once shaken at the name of the Westies, saw the public showing of the gang's crimes. The time of Irish rule was ending, replaced by legal-looking prison and the slow taking apart of an organization built on blood and faithfulness. By the early 1990s, the legal machine was fully working against the Westies. The FBI, armed with many years of watching, helper speaking in court, and physical proof, launched a series of planned charges that aimed at both the leadership and mid-level workers. These trials showed the first time that the full scope of the Westies' operations, from murders to threats to get money and drug moving, was shown in public courtrooms. The court cases were careful, using the RICO Act. Federal lawyers linked many years of violent acts into clear cases of organized criminal business. Each murder, each active threat to get money, and each kidnapping was not just a separate crime, but part of a wider pattern showing the gang's system-wide criminality. This legal plan let multiple members be charged at the same time, striking at the very structure of the organization. James Coonan, the once feared leader, faced trial with the weight of the gang's bloody history pressing down on him. People who saw things, including Mickey Featherstone, gave clear stories of murders done with cleavers, killings in empty buildings, and threat plans that terrorized Hell's Kitchen. Coonan's name for charm and control fell apart under the never-ending speaking in court of former friends turned state witnesses. The trials painted him not as a street legend, but as the planner of many years of planned cruelty. For the mid-level members and street enforcers, the trials were a mix of fear and not believing. Many had long believed that faithfulness and terror could protect them. But the mix of law enforcement plan and helper working together broke this dream. Members faced life sentences or long-term prison, and the feeling of being unbeatable that had defined the Westies for many years disappeared almost overnight. Reactions within the gang were telling. Some members tried to run away, while others thought about working together to reduce their sentences. Fear of everything increased. No one could be sure who had already talked to the authorities. The very fear that had once held the Westies together now grew suspicion, making leavings faster and hurting inside holding together. Personal partnerships that had survived many years of street battles were now worn under the pressure of coming trials. The decisions were decisive. Leaders like Coonan got long sentences, effectively removing the main people of the gang. Mid-level workers faced many years in prison, while smaller enforcers and people connected were put in prison for a mix of crime schemes, murder, and drug moving. The once feared Westies were made powerless, their levels taken apart by a mix of legal plan, inside betrayal, and gathered proof. The trials also had a wider effect. They served as a warning story to other organized crime groups, showing the power of federal court cases when mixed with helper working together. The once in charge Westies, known for their boldness and fearlessness, had fallen not only because of rival gangs or police raids, but because of the combined weight of law enforcement and the fragility of their inside faithfulness. Hell's Kitchen itself reacted to this unraveling. The streets, once under the total control of the Irish mob, became quieter. Bars, businesses, and unions that had long worked under the shadow of Westies' influence began to make operations normal. People living there saw the collapse of a rule that had lasted many years, and the neighborhood slowly began to change, signaling the drop of Irish rule in New York's hidden world. The early 1990s trials marked a clear turning point. The Westies' time of fear and control ended not with a single big battle, but through a mix of plan, betrayal, and legal pressure. The trials showed the depths of their violence, showed the effectiveness of federal court cases, and made solid the move of Hell's Kitchen from a gang-ruled stronghold to a neighborhood underlooking and slowly changing into a different social scene. By the middle 1990s, the Westies' hold on Hell's Kitchen had almost disappeared. The mix of federal court cases, inside betrayal, and never-ending watching had destroyed the gang's leadership and working ability. What remained were broken crews struggling to keep control over small corners of the neighborhood. But the time of Irish rule was clearly over. James Coonan, the once charming and feared leader, was serving a long prison sentence. His influence over Hell's Kitchen existed only in memory, and his authority could no longer make faithfulness or terror happen. The remaining members, without a uniting person, began turning on each other. Wants to succeed that had been checked by fear now exploded in fighting, making the gang's self-destruction faster. Mickey Featherstone's working together with the FB. I had set an example that others followed. More members chose to speak in court or make deals, often in exchange for reduced sentences. This wave of leavings effectively took the gang's weapons away from within. Helpers gave details of continuing criminal activities, making law enforcement raids and catches increasingly effective. The Westies, who had once counted on secrecy and threats, found that every action was now underlooking. The final catches were fast and systematic. Law enforcement planned same-time raids aiming at the remaining leadership and street-level workers. Proof gathered over many years, mixed with recent speaking in court, made sure guilty findings. Members faced charges ranging from crime schemes and murder to drug moving and threats to get money. The gang structure, which had let them rule Hell's Kitchen for many years, was taken apart almost overnight, with the leadership in prison and the remaining members either in prison or working with authorities. The Westies stopped working as a holding together criminal organization. Hell's Kitchen, once the same as Irish mob cruelty, entered a new time law enforcement kept a stronger presence, and the social and money changes in the neighborhood made faster, making the area fancier. New businesses and an incoming of people living there changed the area, leaving little room for organized crime to get a hold again. The collapse of the Westies also had wave effects across New York's hidden world. Italian families who had once counted on the Irish enforcers changed their operations accordingly. Other smaller gangs who might have tried to fill the power-empty space found themselves facing increased law enforcement notice in the staying name of the Westies' violent history. The balance of organized crime in the city moved, making solid the Italian Mafia's rule. For former gang members, the fall was both personal and deep. Prison sentences removed them from their environment, and working together with law enforcement made them strangers to former friends. The culture of fear and respect that had kept the gang going melted away, leaving an empty space that could not be filled. Many faded into being not seen, while others struggled with the results of a lifetime spent in crime. The Westies' end marked the end of a time in New York City, their rise from street-level enforcers to neighborhood rulers, their partnerships with the Gambino family, and their final downfall showed the shaky mix of wanting to succeed, violence, and inside unstaidness. Hell's Kitchen itself was changed, but the stories of the Irish mob's rule continued to have an effect, kept in local memory, criminal history, and media pictures. In the end, the final collapse of the Westies was sure to happen. Many years of extreme violence mixed with inside breaks and the never-ending efforts of law enforcement had made their rule unsustainable. The once feared gang that had controlled Hell's Kitchen with cleavers and guns was reduced to history, leaving a history of both terror and warning for future generations. With the Westies taken apart by the middle 1990s, the members faced a new reality, far removed from the streets they had once controlled. Prison became a hard teacher for many, showing them the cruelty of the criminal justice system and forcing them to face the results of many years of violence. Leaders like James Coonan and his second-in-commands faced life sentences, stripped of the authority that had once defined their existence. For those who stayed alive, the collapse without prison, life was equally not sure. Some tried to go back into society, though the skills made sharp in Hell's Kitchen. Threats, violence, and street cleverness rarely changed to legal work. Former enforcers and people connected struggled with drug use, no job, and the social shame of their pasts. A few managed to find a small amount of normal life, but many remained tied to the history of fear they had once used. Working together with law enforcement also had lasting effects. Members who spoke in court against former friends often found themselves alone, feared by former friends and not trusted even by those outside the gang. Their lives were forever changed as the moral and legal results of betrayal carried long shadows. These helpers, while getting reduced sentences, lived under constant reminders of the violence they had once taken part in and the threats that stayed even after prison. Hell's Kitchen itself changed alongside the fate of the Westies. The streets, once defined by gang control and fear, slowly moved towards safety and rebuilding. Businesses reopened under legal watching, and union operations became less open to mob influence. Making the area fancier brought new people living there and money, wiping away much of the physical proof of Irish mob rule. Yet the neighborhood's cultural memory stayed with stories of the Westies' cruelty kept in books, shows, and local stories. The collapse also caused a move in criminal culture. Young wanting to be gang members no longer looked to the Westies as a model for success. The mix of hard prison sentences, inside betrayal, and law enforcement pressure showed the high cost of careless violence. criminal operations became more careful, planned, and quiet, influenced indirectly by the downfall of one of New York's most famous gangs. Some former Westies turned their energies toward legal businesses. Though the change was rarely smooth, others remained involved in small criminal activity, held back by the increased looking of law enforcement and the name results of their past. The difference between former rule and the limited reality of life after collapse highlighted the fragility of power, based only on fear and violence. The effect over generations on Hell's Kitchen was also important. People living there who had grown up under the shadow of the Irish mob saw the neighborhoods change from a territory of terror to a community looking for new life. The stories of violence and staying alive became warning tales for younger generations, showing the dangers of unchecked wanting to succeed and the final cost of a life in crime. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the history of the Westies had become both historical and warning. The gang's former members were spread around, some in prison, some moving through new lives, and others struggling with the staying effects of their past. Hell's Kitchen changed physically and in culture, no longer bore the same marks of rule, though its history stayed cut into its identity. The story of the Westies after events highlighted a basic truth. Power built on fear and violence is not permanent. The rise of the gang had been dramatic and frightening, but the fall was equally sure to happen, shaping the lives of its members and the community they once ruled. The lessons of faithfulness, betrayal, and staying alive became part of Hell's Kitchen's shared memory, influencing not just those directly involved, but the culture of the city itself, even many years after their collapse. The Westies continued to shape the cultural and media scene of New York City and beyond. Their story became a reference point for writers, filmmakers, and newspaper writers trying to catch the raw violence and rough reality of city organized crime. Unlike the more structured Italian mafia, the Westies were shown as not predictable, ruthless, and intensely local. A perfect example of the streets themselves. Books writing about Hell's Kitchen often showed the Westies' rise as a mix of boldness, faithfulness, and cruelty. Writers highlighted not just the crimes, but the mind behind them. A world in which staying alive depended on fear, respect, and immediate action. The Westies' use of cleavers, axes, and public threats became famous signs of street-level Irish gangster life, different sharply with the more formal, ritualized violence of Italian families. Film and television took heavily from their history. Crime dramas and shows showed Hell's Kitchen as a theater of raw violence with characters inspired by James Coonan, Mickey Featherstone, and other famous people. The Westies' messy yet controlled way to street control became a story device, showing both the excitement and the danger of life in organized crime. Even in made-up stories, the gang's notoriety gave realness to pictures of city criminal life, influencing public view of Irish mobs in America. The media also stressed the Westies joining with the Gambino family, highlighting the meeting point of ethnic gangs and wider organized crime networks. These stories highlighted the delicate balance between independence and partnership, showing how smaller gangs could use connections with more powerful families, while still risking total destruction if those relationships went bad. The Westies' story became a warning tale, showing how wanting to succeed, boldness, and carelessness could crash with larger criminal structures to terrible effect. In criminal stories and law enforcement studies, the Westies were looked at for both their ways and their failures. Scholars and officers examined how tightly knit neighborhood gangs could get and keep power, but also how inside fighting and too much violence hurt long-term steadiness. The gangs counting on fear as a controlling way mixed with weak inside. Control offered lessons for understanding the dynamics of organized crime beyond the Irish mob itself. The history of the Westies also influenced views of Irish-American identity in the context of crime. While many Irish immigrants had risen through real labor and political channels, the Westies' notoriety created a parallel story of fighting back, street justice, and criminal boldness. This two-sided nature, pride in toughness and fear of lawbreaking, remained part of the cultural understanding of Irish-American communities in New York and elsewhere. Hell's Kitchen itself became a sign of change, where the memory of gang violence existed at the same time with new life and making the area fancier. Former strongholds of Westies' influence, bars, union halls, and street corners were used for new things or remembered through stories, paintings on walls, and local history projects. The neighborhood's identity was forever shaped by the presence of the Westies, serving as both warning and legend for future generations. Even in popular imagination, the Westies story remains interesting. The mix of faithfulness, cruelty, personal wanting to succeed, and sure betrayal has an effect as a human drama set against the background of cities staying alive. Their history in media, books, and public memory highlights the lasting interest with organized crime, particularly when it meets with ethnicity, neighborhood, and personal relationships. In the end, the Westies' cultural influence reached far beyond Hell's Kitchen. They became part of a larger American story about the meeting point of crime, immigrant identity, and city life. The violence and boldness that once defined their existence continued to echo through books, films, and shared memory, making sure that while the gang no longer existed, its legend kept going. The collapse of the Westies left a deep mark not only on Hell's Kitchen, but also on the wider way to organized crime in New York City. Law enforcement agencies studied their rise and fall carefully, seeing that the mix of extreme violence, tight-knit neighborhood networks, and cross-ethnic partnerships posed both tests and chances for policing. The Westies became a case study in the risks of thinking little of street-level gangs and the power of inside betrayal. One of the main lessons for police and federal agencies was the importance of information and helper networks. The Westies had long worked under the radar, controlling their environment through fear rather than open working together. It was only through grown helpers like Mickey, Featherstone, and watching efforts that authorities could unravel the gang structure. Modern policing plans in New York more and more stressed getting inside, electronic watching, and careful witness protection, ways directly taught by successes against the Irish mob. The Westies' working ways also influenced law enforcement plans. Their counting on fear and public shows of violence showed both the power and danger of unchecked aggression. Police began to watch patterns of threats, gang communication, and violent increases, using guessing ways to prevent outbreaks of organized crime before they grew. The lessons learned in Hell's Kitchen taught task forces dealing with other gangs in the city, including Italian Mafia families, Russian crime groups, and new street gangs. For modern criminal structures, the Westies served as a warning tale. Their first success in making power solid through fear and local partnerships showed how small, tightly knit groups could rule neighborhoods. Yet their final downfall showed the fragility of organizations that counted heavily on threats without strong inside control or strategic future sight. Contemporary gangs often studied these patterns, changing their ways to avoid the mistakes that had undone the Westies. Hell's Kitchen itself became a laboratory for watching the effect of gang collapse on city communities. With the Irish mob's drop, neighborhoods could put rebuilding projects into action, make community policing stronger, and reduce the influence of organized crime on labor unions and local businesses. The change of Hell's Kitchen showed that effective law enforcement, mixed with money and social projects, could take back areas before ruled by gangs. The Westies' history also added to the change of legal plans. Lawyers saw the power of the RICO Act, witness working together, and complete writing down of criminal patterns. These ways, proven effective against the Irish mob, became standard in aiming at other organized crime networks. The mix of federal watching, neighborhood policing, and community working together created a model for breaking up criminal businesses beyond New York. Even many years later, the memory of the Westies influenced the city's way to security. The neighborhood streets, once terrorized by the gang's cruelty, now benefit from both historical knowing and acting first policing, gang activities closely watched, and community programs aim to prevent the rise of a similar organization. The lessons learned from the Westies' rule continue to teach plans for public safety, city planning, and crime prevention. In the end, the Westies' influence reached beyond their lifetime as a gang. They shaped modern law enforcement ways, taught plans for dealing with neighborhood-based organized crime, and gave a warning model for both criminals and authorities. The mix of extreme violence, inside betrayal, and legal pressure created a plan for taking apart street-level gangs, making sure that while Hell's Kitchen had once been a stronghold of fear, it could be taken back and reshaped for the future. The fall of the Westies became more than a historical event. It changed into a lesson for future generations of criminals in New York City. Their path from street-level enforcers to neighborhood rulers, and finally to collapse under law enforcement pressure and inside. Betrayal gave a warning tale that echoed throughout Hell's Kitchen and beyond. Future criminals studied the Westies' rise with interest. Their boldness, charm, and ability to make control happen through fear showed how a small, determined group could rule a neighborhood. Young gang members admired the faithfulness and courage shown in their operations, but they were equally wary of the results that finally happened to them. The Westies' downfall highlighted the risks built into overcounting on violence, sudden action, and poor inside control. The lessons were clear. Other gangs learned that partnerships with more powerful criminal organizations could give temporary protection and made bigger chance. But they also created weak spots. The Westies' partnership with the Gambino family, while helpful at first, finally showed them to legal looking and highlighted the dangers of intergang dependence. Wanting to succeed, when mixed with carelessness, became a dangerous mix that no partnership could cover. Inside betrayal served as another key warning. The leaving of Mickey Featherstone and later working together of other members showed that faithfulness within a violent organization could be fragile, especially under the pressure of legal results. Gangs that followed watched how fear of everything, and substance abuse could weaken holding together, making even the most feared organization open to attack to collapse. Law enforcement, too. True lessons that shaped future interactions with organized crime. The Westies taking apart showed the effectiveness of planned federal investigations, the strategic use of the RICO Act, and the growing of helpers. Modern policing plans more and more counted on information, watching, and witness protection, making sure that criminal businesses faced both inside and outside pressures that could be used. The neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen served as a living example for young criminals and watchers alike. The dramatic change from a gang-ruled area to a watched, made fancier community showed the results of unchecked criminal activity. Area control, once a sign of power, could be wiped out by legal step-in and social change. The Westies' history gave both inspiration and something to stop, a model of wanting to succeed and boldness. shadowed by the surety of results, when law, faithfulness, and plan were forgotten. For other New York gangs, the story was clear. Success in organized crime needed more than violence and threats. Control, future sight, and careful management of inside relationships were critical. The Westies' sudden cruelty, which had first made their power solid, finally became the way of their downfall. This understanding shaped the plans of new groups in the city, influencing decisions about partnerships, inside government, and ways of threats. In addition, the Westies' story made stronger the importance of community influence. Neighborhoods that allowed or feared gangs could be open to attack. But once law enforcement and social structures stepped in, the environment could move fast. The Westies' collapse showed how the balance between fear, respect, and legal authority was delicate and easily broken. In the end, the fall of the Westies became a story of cause and effect for future generations of criminals. It showed that boldness and violence could give short-term rule, but without strategic future sight, holding together, and an understanding of legal results, long life was impossible. The story of Hell's Kitchen, the Irish mob, and the Westies' dramatic rise and fall became both a plan and a warning, shaping the behavior of other gangs and influencing law enforcement plans across New York. While the Westies were mainly a neighborhood-focused gang, their operations unavoidably met with wider criminal networks, both across the country and around the world. Their partnership with the Gambino family was the most famous example of cross-organizational working together, but their influence reached beyond Hell's Kitchen, touching ports, unions, and illegal trade routes across the United States. The partnership with the Gambino family was based on a plan and helped both sides. The Westies gave enforcement services, threats, and localized control, letting the Italian Mafia make operations bigger with very small risk. In return, they got protection, access to larger-scale criminal businesses, and a degree of realness within the hidden world levels. This relationship showed how smaller ethnically based gangs could use partnerships with larger organizations to increase both profit and power. Beyond New York, the Westies' actions had wave effects. Their involvement in union manipulation, trucking, and waterfront operations met with national labor movements and shipping routes. Organized crime groups in other port cities and industrial centers watched the Westies' plans, taking on similar ways of threats, paying off, and local control. While the Westies themselves rarely worked outside New York, their ways influenced wider patterns of organized crime across the country. The gang also became part of the information and law enforcement playbook. Federal agencies watched their activities not only for local criminal life, but also for possible links to international smuggling, drug moving, and organized crime networks. Even as their physical operations remained largely local, the Westies' connection with major Italian families connected them to national and international flows of illegal goods, money cleaning, and illegal influence. Competition with other criminal groups further highlighted their role in the wider hidden world. Rival Irish gangs in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago studied the Westies' plans, taking lessons in both street enforcement and strategic partnerships. Italian Mafia families in other cities noted the effectiveness and final weak spot of a gang working with boldness, but not enough control. The Westies' path offered a warning tale for criminal organizations, looking for fast making bigger without enough inside control. Around the world, the Westies' operations were less direct, but still notable. Smuggling networks, particularly in drugs and stolen goods, sometimes met with their activities in New York's docks and storage places. Their enforcement role within these operations showed how neighborhood gangs could influence wider criminal markets, even without setting up formal international networks. Watchers in Europe and Canada, particularly those studying organized Irish crime, noted the efficiency and cruelty of Hell's Kitchen's mobsters as a model for threat-based area control. The drop of the Westies also sent a clear message across criminal networks. Partnerships with more powerful families gave chance, but also showing their collapse showed how federal court cases, helpers, and inside fighting could take apart even highly feared organizations. International criminal networks took note, changing plans to avoid similar weak spots, making sure that their operations balanced boldness with control. By the late 1990s, the Westies' role in national and international organized crime had effectively ended. Their influence continued through the ways they used and the warning lessons they left behind. The joining of local enforcement plans, partnership management, and area control taught later plans for gangs across the United States. While law enforcement agencies made their ways better for breaking up multi-level criminal networks, in the end, the Westies' interaction with wider criminal organizations showed the connectedness of local and world crime. Their stories showed how a neighborhood gang could affect national networks, influence international criminal ways, and leave a history that reached far beyond the streets of Hell's Kitchen. Their rise and fall became both an inspiration and a warning, shaping the plans of criminals and authorities alike. By the late 1990s, the Westies as a holding-together organization had stopped existing. What remained were broken crews, small groups of former enforcers, and a few independent workers trying to keep influence in Hell's Kitchen. These leftovers lacked the leadership, working together, and fear-based authority that had once defined the gang, leaving them open to attack to both law enforcement and rival criminal organizations. The Italian Mafia, particularly the Gambino family, made its rule solid during this time. With the Westies weakened and broken, the Italians took in many of the gang's former operations, including protection crime schemes, union manipulation, and control of local businesses. The collapse of the Irish mob removed a layer of not being predictable from New York's criminal scene, letting the Italian families use more structured, controlled control over the city's hidden world. The remaining Westies worked sometimes, trying small-scale criminal businesses, often aiming at local bars, nightclubs, and small gambling operations. Without central leadership or working together, these groups were largely not effective and easily taken apart by law enforcement. Catches and court cases continued, making sure that Hell's Kitchen could no longer support a gang of the Westies' former size or cruelty. Some former members tried to remake themselves, either through real work or small criminal activity. A few tried to use past connections for small-scale smuggling or lending money at high cost. But the absence of a single set of levels made these operations limited in scope and high in risk. The history of fear they had once used no longer protected them, and federal authorities remained watchful, watching any attempt at coming back. For the Italian Mafia, the breaking up of the Westies was both a strategic chance and a warning lesson. They learned how counting on outside friends could be helpful, but also risky. By taking in former Westies operations, the Gambino family made stronger its own rule, showing that centralized, controlled criminal businesses were more sustainable than broken up, violent neighborhood gangs. The experience of the Westies influenced Italian plans for managing partnerships, controlling territories, and making inside unsteadiness less. Hell's Kitchen went through important social and money change during this time, making the area fancier. Business development and increased policing replaced the fear-based environment with controlled city life. While the history of the Westies remained part of the neighborhood's identity, the streets themselves became safer, and the structures of control put in place by the Irish mob were taken apart completely. People living there who had once feared payback from the gang now saw a new life of their community. The final taking apart of Westies also had symbolic meaning. The end of their rule marked the clear closing of a time in New York's criminal history, moving the story from one of Irish mob rule to a time ruled by more organized, controlled, and centralized criminal businesses. Law enforcement celebrated the victories, and historians wrote down the lessons learned from the rise and fall of a gang that had once terrorized a whole neighborhood. In the end, the story of the Westies' final stage stressed the fragility of power built on fear, sudden violence, and inside not being together. Without leadership, holding together, and strategic control, even the most feared gangs could be taken apart. The Italian Mafias making solid of control in Hell's Kitchen and other areas of New York showed the change of organized crime, highlighting the difference between messy street gangs and structured criminal empires. By the turn of the 1,000 years, the Westies existed only in memory. Their influence on the streets of Hell's Kitchen effectively wiped away. But their history kept in the warning tales, legal plans, and cultural stories that continued to shape both criminals and law enforcement. Even many years after their breaking up, the Westies left a mark that cannot be removed on how Irish-American gangs are seen in the United States. Their story became a standard for understanding the meeting point of ethnicity, neighborhood identity, and organized crime. Unlike the more structured Italian Mafia, the Westies were made romantic and feared for their boldness, street-level violence, and raw, unpolished way to criminal business. Books and looking into journalism wrote about their rise and fall, painting clear pictures of a gang that mixed faithfulness, cruelty, and personal wanting to succeed. Writers stressed both the fear they inspired in Hell's Kitchen and the mind complication of their leaders. James Coonan and Mickey Featherstone, in particular, became signs of the two-sided nature of criminal life. Charm and cleverness, balanced by sudden action and unsteadiness. The story of the Westies highlighted how local identity and personal relationships could drive both the success and downfall of a gang. In film and television, the Westies' history influenced the picture of Irish-American gangs. Shows and movies often took ideas from their ways and personalities, stressing their not being predictable and violent style. Characters based on Coonan or Featherstone became perfect examples. Leaders who commanded fear and faithfulness, yet were open to attack to betrayal and legal step in. These pictures added to a wider public view of Irish gangs as both made romantic anti-heroes and warning people. The Westies also influenced the picture of Hell's Kitchen itself. Media pictures changed the neighborhood into a sign of rough city criminal life, a place where faithfulness and violence told social order. Even as making the area fancier changed the physical and social scene, the memory of Westies' rules stayed, creating a set of stories that mixed history, folk stories, and made dramatic storytelling. Culturally, the Westies shaped talks about Irish-American identity. Their story highlighted a difference between mainstream stories of immigrant success and the subculture of street-level criminal life. They became a reminder of the strains between poverty, community faithfulness, and the pull of power through violence. This two-sided nature influenced both school and popular talk, looking at how ethnicity, environment, and chance met in the context of city crime. The gang's notoriety also gave material for true crime lovers. Historians and crime scientists looks at their ways, inside fights, and final collapse offered understandings into gang dynamics, faithfulness, and the mind of organized crime. Scholars compared the Westies to other ethnic gangs, noting how neighborhood holding together, fear, and personal relationships influence operations differently than in larger, more formal criminal organizations. Even in contemporary pop culture, references to the Westies continue. Books, shows, and television specials look at their crimes, partnerships, and downfall, stressing lessons about faithfulness, wanting to succeed, and the results of violent lifestyles. Their story has an effect because it is both human and extreme. A clear showing of the complication of criminal life in a special historical and social context. In the end, the Westies' influence on modern view is two-part. They serve as a sign of bold street-level Irish-American criminal life, catching imagination and fear alike. At the same time, their story works as a warning tale, showing the fragility of power built on violence, sudden action, and shaky partnerships. Their history keeps going in media, cultural memory, and the continuing interest with the darker corners of American city life. The Westies' notoriety reached far beyond Hell's Kitchen through the legends and myths that came up during and after their rule. These stories, often made more exciting by the media, helped make solid the gang's image as both terrifying and almost movie-like people in the public's imagination. Their name for cruelty, faithfulness, and boldness became material for tales that made fuzzy fact and fiction. One of the most lasting legends involved the use of cleavers and axes during violent meetings. While law enforcement records said yes to many such events, media outlets made these stories bigger, turning them into signs of the gang's frightening identity. These tools became famous in popular culture, representing the raw, gut-level violence that set the Westies apart from other organized crime groups. Even many years later, pictures of Irish-American gangs often reference this imagery, highlighting its lasting cultural echo. Stories of James Coonan's charm and cleverness also became part of the set of stories. Stories of his ability to command faithfulness, scare rivals, and move through partnerships with the Gambino family showed him as both a master planner and a ruthless enforcer. Media stories often framed him as the perfect street boss, charming, not predictable, and dangerously smart. Such pictures added to the lasting interest with the Westies' leadership and the personalities behind their crimes. Mickey Featherstone's leaving and later working together with the FBI became another legendary part of Westies' stories. His insider stories gave detailed understanding into the gang's operations, showing murders, threats to get money, and drug moving. Media coverage of his speaking in court stressed the strain between faithfulness and staying alive, making stronger the story that even the most devoted members were finally human and open to attack. Featherstone's story became a centerpiece in shows and books, showing both the courage and moral complication of those involved in organized crime. Local stories and city legends also made the gang's mystery bigger. Tales of street-level meetings, daring robberies, and violent payback moved around in Hell's Kitchen for years, often made bigger or changed with each telling. People living there spoke of close escapes, sudden acts of violence, and the everywhere fear that defined daily life. These community stories, alongside media coverage, helped make solid the Westies' name as both bad people and neighborhood legends. The gang's influence on popular culture was further made bigger through true crime books, shows, and made dramatic versions. Writers and filmmakers took heavily from Westies' stories to pass on the raw intensity of city criminal life. Their operations, partnerships, and inside betrayals gave rich material for looking at themes of faithfulness, wanting to succeed, and the results of violence. The Westies' story offered a mix of history, morality, and show that proved impossible to fight for people interested by organized crime. Even made-up stories of Irish gangs often borrowed parts from the Westies story. Character-perfect examples, ways of threats, and neighborhood dynamics echoed the real-life experiences of Hell's Kitchen's famous people living there. These pictures made stronger the gang's cultural history, sticking their image into the wider understanding of Irish-American organized crime. In the end, the legends, myths, and media pictures of the Westies made sure that their story would keep going long after their physical presence disappeared from the streets. They became a sign of both boldness and warning, a clear reminder of the extremes of faithfulness, violence, and wanting to succeed in city criminal life. The Westies story continues to catch interest, mixing history with legend to shape the shared imagination surrounding Irish-American gangs. The Westies' violent rule in Hell's Kitchen left more than a history of fear. It reshaped the legal, policing, and preventative scene in New York City. Lawmakers, lawyers, and law enforcement agencies closely studied the gang's operations, using their rise and fall to teach plans aimed at slowing organized crime in city neighborhoods. One of the most important legal effects was the making stronger of the RICO Act as a tool to take apart criminal businesses. Lawyers noted that piece-by-piece charges against single gang members were not enough to address system-wide crime. The Westies planned murders, threat plans, and connections to larger organizations like the Gambino family gave a clear example of why complete legal structures were necessary. Their court case became a plan for applying RICO in later cases across the country. Law enforcement agencies also changed their looking into ways. The effectiveness of using insider working together, watching, and long-term information gathering against the Westies showed that street-level gangs could be taken apart without direct meetings. Programs focusing on growing helpers, watching communications, and connecting patterns of crime became standard practice in New York City policing. The Westies' downfall showed that even the most violent and feared gangs could be made neutral through plan rather than raw force. The collapse of the Westies influenced preventative projects as well. Community policing, neighborhood reaching out, and youth programs aiming at reducing gang recruitment gained importance in Hell's Kitchen and other high-risk areas. Authorities realized that sustainable reductions in organized crime needed not only catches, but also social step-ins that offered other choices to the pull of gang life. Schools, youth centers, and local organizations became key partners in preventing the next generation from repeating the mistakes of the Westies. Also, their story taught risk judging and city planning plans. Law enforcement learned to identify the conditions that let gangs like the Westies do well. Money being pushed to the edges, weak watching of unions and businesses, and tightly knit local communities open to attack to threats. By addressing these weak spots, authorities could make less the likelihood of similar gangs getting control in other neighborhoods. The Westies' downfall also became a moral and warning lesson for young people living there. Stories of faithfulness, betrayal, and final results highlighted the high price of criminal wanting to succeed. The gang's rise showed the attractive power of boldness and control, while their collapse highlighted the surety of legal and personal results. For teachers, law enforcement, and community leaders, the Westies story became a teaching tool, showing the dangers of organized crime in a very touchable and local context. Further, the court case of the Westies set examples for working together between local police, federal agencies, and the court system. Planned efforts in watching catches, and trials showed that complicated criminal organizations could be taken apart through joint plan. These models influenced future operations against both ethnic and multi-generational gangs in New York. making sure a history of practical lessons alongside the cultural memory of Hell's Kitchen's Irish mob. In the end, the Westies' effect on law, policing, and crime prevention reached far beyond Hell's Kitchen. Their existence and collapse reshaped how New York City came near organized crime, made stronger the importance of joint legal plans, and gave a warning structure for future generations. The story of boldness, violence, and sure results became a cornerstone in the city's understanding of gang dynamics and city safety. Even many years after their breaking up, the Westies continue to have an effect in the criminal folk stories of New York City. In Hell's Kitchen and beyond, stories of their boldness, cruelty, and street-level cleverness have become part of a spoken-down tradition that mixes history, myth, and warning story. The gang's deeds are remembered as both terrifying and legendary, forming a cultural lens through which people living there, writers, and wanting to be criminals view the past. One lasting part of this folk stories is the idea of never-beaten fighters. Westies members who, even with very big odds, met rivals, law enforcement, and even their own friends with fearlessness. Tales of last-minute escapes, cleaver fights in dimly lit alleys, and violent paybacks against betrayal are told again in bars, local gatherings, and family short stories. Often with dramatic adding to, these stories make solid the gang's image as never-ending, street smart, and not predictable. Another important theme is payback. City legend tells of acts of paying back, where a seen insult or challenge demanded immediate and cruel answer. These stories added to the gang's set of stories, showing them as defenders of honor, neighborhood control, and personal faithfulness. Even after the Westies' collapse, such tales inspired both warning and admiration, making stronger the moral that disloyalty and weakness were quickly punished. The gangs joining into popular culture made these legends bigger. Writers and filmmakers borrowed heavily from these stories, showing Hell's Kitchen as a scene where courage, cleverness, and cruelty met. Characters inspired by Westies members became perfect examples. Fearless enforcers, clever leaders, and sad people undone by their own violence. This representation kept the folk stories going, making sure that even made-up stories kept a core connection to historical events. Local youth often grew up hearing these tales, learning the lessons of boldness, faithfulness, and result. While some stories were warning against the dangers of crime, others made the excitement and power connected with Westies' rule seem attractive. This two-sided nature, admiration made less severe by warning, helped shape the neighborhood's understanding of criminal life and staying alive. The Westies' set of stories also serves as a cultural touchstone for understanding New York's wider organized crime history. By comparing Irish mob legends to Italian mafia stories or Russian crime stories, both scholars and the public gain understanding into the ways neighborhood, ethnicity, and personal relationships shape criminal businesses. The Westies, in this sense, act as a bridge between local folk stories and system-wide understanding of crime. Even law enforcement says yes to the role of folk stories in keeping the Westies' history going. Understanding how stories of fear, payback, and being unbeatable shape community view teaches policing plans, community reaching out, and crime prevention. The continuing of these legends highlights the human interest with boldness, danger, and moral result in city life in the end. The criminal folk stories surrounding the Westies keeps their memory in a way that mixes history and legend. They are remembered not only as criminals, but as cultural famous people whose actions, personalities, and choices continue to shape the story of Hell's Kitchen. The stories of never-beaten fighters and never-ending payback remain, a proof of the lasting power of city myth in the complicated history of one of New York's most famous gangs. Understanding the Westies needs more than a telling again of their crimes. It demands a look at their mind, reasons, and the inside rules that control their behavior. Under the surface of cleavers, threats, and street violence lay a complicated social and moral structure that guided the gang's interactions. Faithfulness and sense of identity. At the core of Westies culture was faithfulness. Members were expected to follow their leaders without question and support the name of the gang at all costs. This faithfulness reached not only to personal relationships, but also to the neighborhood itself. Hell's Kitchen was both their territory and their identity. Breaking this trust through betrayal or weakness was considered one of the worst wrongs. Often punished with cruel violence, the stress on faithfulness created a strong sense of holding together, at least for a time, and defined the social levels within the gang. Fear, in a seeming contradiction, was both a tool and a defining mind trait. Leaders like James Coonan and Mickey Featherstone put fear into their rivals and people under them alike, but they also worked under the constant pressure of possible betrayal or legal result. The Westies counting on threats created a loop. Power made fear stronger, which made faithfulness stronger, which then demanded more acts of boldness and violence to keep authority. This circle shaped their decision-making, often choosing immediate shows of strength over long-term plan. Violence itself was made into rules. The Westies followed an informal set of rules about when and how to answer to insults, tests, or moves into territory. Murders, attacks, and threats were not random, but guided by a practical and often cruel understanding of staying alive and name. Mind strength, aggression, and quick reactions were highly valued traits, forming the base of the gang's identity and selection rules for trusted members. Personal wanting to succeed and pride played an important role in the inside culture. Members tried to prove themselves through daring acts, faithfulness under pressure, and the ability to do tasks others would avoid. This wanting to succeed grew competition, sometimes resulting in inside fighting, but it also drove the gang to reach a level of notoriety not matched by other local organizations. The mix of faithfulness, wanting to succeed, and fear created a shaky but effective social structure until it collapsed under pressure from law enforcement and inside betrayal. Substance use and mind health were also under the surface factors in Westie's mind. Alcohol and drugs were commonly used both to deal with the stress of violent lifestyles and as part of social bonding. These substances sometimes made aggression bigger, damaged thinking, and made inside fights faster. Adding to the gang's final downfall, the mind strain of constant watching, fear of betrayal, and moral compromises left lasting marks on staying alive members. Finally, the Westies' rules stressed a form of street justice. They saw themselves as judges of their own moral universe, where personal honor, faithfulness to the neighborhood, and protection of their own defined the rules, while outsiders saw their actions as lawless cruelty within the gang. These acts were made right as necessary for staying alive. Respect and the keeping of identity. In all, the mind picture of the Westies shows a complicated play between faithfulness, fear, wanting to succeed, aggression, and moral rule. Their inside culture, while effective for a time, also contained the seeds of their collapse. Understanding this dimension lights up not just their crimes, but the human reasons, social structures, and cultural pressures that shaped one of New York's most famous gangs. The collapse of the Westies left many of its members meeting a very different world. For some, prison became the defining chapter of their lives. People like James Coonan, once feared and charming leaders, faced long sentences that stripped them of authority, influence, and the day-to-day power they had used in Hell's Kitchen. The move from control to being locked up, forced looking inside, frustration, and in some cases, attempts at making peace with their past. Mickey Featherstone, whose working together with the FB I had played a key role in taking apart the gang, faced a complicated history. While he got reduced sentencing, the decision to speak in court against former friends made him a stranger from the criminal community and left him open to attack to both legal and personal results. Life after prison needed moving through a society that looked at him with suspicion, fear, or interest, highlighting the human cost of staying alive within a violent organization. Other members tried to go back into regular person life, often struggling to find steadiness. Skills made sharp in the streets, threats, violence, and talking under threat rarely changed to legal work. Some turned to real work, while others remained on the edges of criminal activity, trying small-scale businesses that carried both risk and very small reward. Money unsteadiness, staying fear of payback, and social shame shaped their after-gang existence. Substance abuse and mind health issues made these tests more complicated. Years of showing to violence, stress, and the pressures of leadership left deep mind marks. Drug use, deep sadness, and worry were common among former members. Making efforts to set up a law-following life hard, support systems were scarce, and the culture of silence and self-reliance made sharp by the gang made looking for help difficult. Family dynamics also moved dramatically. Children, husbands or wives, and extended family members had experienced the direct results of gang life. Loss, fear, and social shame. Rebuilding relationships needed honesty, responsibility, and often years of effort. Some former Westies successfully set up bonds again with loved ones, while others remained made strangers, haunted by past choices and the violent histories of their community. A few members tried to use their notoriety for creative or legal pursuits. Books, talks, and shows gave chances to share their stories, sometimes as warning tales, sometimes as a way to make peace with the public interest surrounding the Westies. These efforts gave money and a form of identity beyond the gang, though they could also start up again argument or personal danger. For the community of Hell's Kitchen, the leaving of the Westies marked a cultural and social move. People living there who had lived under fear now watched former members moving through legal systems, getting better, and societal going back in. The neighborhoods change through making the area fancier, increased policing, and social programs mirrored the personal changes of those formerly tied to the gang. In the end, the after-collapse lives of Westies members show the long-term results of criminal life. While some found change in staying alive, others were permanently shaped or held back by their past. Their stories reflect the human side of organized crime, faithfulness, betrayal, wanting to succeed, and the struggle to make peace with past choices, with the realities of a world that had moved beyond the rule of Hell's Kitchen's most famous gang. The history of the Westies had a deep effect on modern law enforcement and crime prevention plans in New York City. Their rise and fall gave real lessons in understanding how neighborhood-based gangs work, the weak spots they use, and the plans necessary to take apart or prevent similar organizations from getting power. Law enforcement agencies made better looking into ways based on the Westies' operations. The gang had shown the dangers of tightly knit groups with strong local influence, and authorities saw that watching, help were growing, and planned federal and local action were essential. The success of these ways in taking apart the Westies taught policing plans for other ethnic gangs and multi-layered criminal businesses across the city. The court case of the Westies also highlighted the importance of complete legal structures. Applying the RICO Act and planning charges across multiple crimes led authorities aim at the gang as a structured thing rather than a lone people. This way became a model for future investigations, showing how legal tools could address system-wide criminal behavior instead of focusing only on street-level wrongs. Beyond enforcement, the Westies' history influenced preventative programs aiming at youth and at-risk communities. Schools, community centers, and nonprofits made projects to turn young people away from gang involvement, offering education, guidance, and job training. The story of the Westies, both their bold rise and final downfall, served as a warning tale in these programs, showing the dangers of crime, faithfulness to the wrong structures, and the results of violence. Community policing also got good from lessons learned from the Westies' control of Hell's Kitchen. Authorities understood that involvement with local people living there, watching of neighborhood dynamics, an early step in could prevent the making solid of gang power. Programs stressing neighborhood, working together, and reporting became central in reducing the conditions that had let the Westies do well. Also, law enforcement training took in mind and social studies of gangs like the Westies. Officers learned to recognize patterns of threats, recruitment, inside fighting, and the effect of neighborhood identity on gang holding together. Understanding these dynamics made working effectiveness better and allowed for more fine ways to crime prevention and community involvement. The Westies' influence also reached to wider criminal justice policy. Policymakers examined how social not being equal, money being pushed to the edges, and limited chances added to the formation of gangs. Money put into education, youth services, and work programs were taught by the understanding that crime could be made less through social development alongside traditional policing. In the end, the story of the Westies became a plan for a many-sided way to city crime. By mixing legal plan, community involvement, social step-in, and historical understanding, New York City developed more effective ways to prevent the rise of similar gangs. The history of Hell's Kitchen's Irish mob thus reached beyond history, shaping modern policing, youth programs, and the city's way to crime prevention for generations to come. Even many years after their breaking up, the memory of the Westies continues to shape Hell's Kitchen's cultural scene. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear and violence, now keeps the history of the gang through stories, paintings on walls, shows, and local stories, saying yes to the past while growing a sense of thinking and education. Paintings on walls and street art have come up as a famous way of remembering the neighborhood's complicated history. Some pieces show the streets as they were during the Westies' rule, showing scenes of daily life under the gang's control. Others celebrate the strength of people living there, showing community togetherness in the face of fear. These visual pictures bridge history and modern identity, reminding people living there and visitors alike of both the dangers and the human stories of Hell's Kitchen. Local historians and writers have also played a key role in keeping the memory of the Westies. Books, articles, and spoken-down histories write down the gang's rise, inside dynamics, and final downfall by recording personal stories, talks with former members, and community views. These works make sure that the Westies' story is not lost to time. The stories offer understandings into the social and money conditions of the time, giving context for both the gang's actions and the neighborhood's change. Shows and media productions add to the cultural memory as well. Films, television specials, and true crime programs look at the lives of James Coonan, Mickey Featherstone, and other key people, making events dramatic while grounding them in historical research. These productions reach wider people, making the Westies story bigger beyond New York and influencing views of city crime, faithfulness, and neighborhood identity. Community projects further keep the Westies' history through education and public involvement. Walking tours, neighborhood museums, and local talks highlight Hell's Kitchen's past, including the time ruled by the Irish mob. These programs balance interest with warning, teaching visitors and younger generations about the pull and dangers of gang life, and stressing the social and money changes that let the neighborhood recover. Even in everyday talk, the Westies remain a point of reference. People living there share stories of past events, legendary people, and close escapes, mixing fact with myth. This spoken-down history keeps the gang's presence in local culture, showing how memory and identity are twisted with past experiences of crime and community strength. The keeping of Westies' history also serves as a tool for thinking and warning. By keeping awareness of the gang's influence, the neighborhood and city at large make stronger lessons about faithfulness, wanting to succeed, and the results of violence. The memory of Hell's Kitchen's Irish mob continues to teach contemporary discussions about crime, city development, and the importance of community watchfulness. In the end, the Westies' history in Hell's Kitchen is complicated. They are remembered for their boldness and notoriety, but also for the fear and break they caused through paintings on walls, books, media, and community involvement. Their story remains alive, a lasting part of the neighborhood's cultural fabric that educates, warns, and catches interest, making sure that the history of Hell's Kitchen's Irish mob is neither forgotten nor ignored. The story of the Westies is in the end a tale of wanting to succeed. Faithfulness, fear, and result, a writing that shaped not only Hell's Kitchen, but also the wider criminal and cultural scene of New York City. From their rise in the rough streets of Hell's Kitchen to their partnerships with powerful Mafia families, the Westies showed the complications of neighborhood-based organized crime. Their boldness and cruelty let them rule a tight-knit community, making area control happen and putting in fear. Yet this same counting on violence, sudden action, and inside unsteadiness finally led to their downfall. The Westies' path shows a basic truth about criminal organizations. Short-term power built on fear can only last so long before legal pressure, inside betrayal, and social change take it apart. The Westies' interactions with larger criminal networks, particularly the Gambino family, highlight the connectedness of organized crime. Their story shows how smaller local gangs could influence national operations, while remaining open to attack to the structural and strategic advantages of larger organizations. Their rise and fall taught law enforcement plans, showing the importance of information, helper networks, and complete legal tools like the RICO Act. Beyond law enforcement, the Westies' history reaches into culture and shared memory. Books, shows, films, and folk stories have kept their story, showing the gang as both terrifying and interest-catching. They remain signs of boldness, faithfulness, and the moral complication of criminal life, serving as warning examples for young people wanting to be criminals and historians alike. Their influence shapes how Irish-American gangs are seen and continues to teach stories about city crime in the United States. In Hell's Kitchen, the Westies' effect is touchable in both physical and cultural terms. Neighborhoods changed, making the area fancier reshaped streets once ruled by fear. And community programs helped prevent the rise of similar organizations. Paintings on walls, local history projects, and spoken-down traditions keep the memory of the gang, stressing lessons about faithfulness, wanting to succeed, and result while celebrating the strength of the community that stayed alive them. In the mind and social sciences, the Westies give a window into the dynamics of human behavior under extreme conditions. Their culture based on faithfulness, fear, aggression. And personal wanting to succeed offers understandings into how criminal organizations form, work, and finally collapse. The play between personality, environment, and situation explains both their success and their failure, making them a subject of study for crime scientists, historians, and mind scientists alike. In the end, the Westies story is a many-sided story that goes across crime, culture, community, and law. They shaped New York's criminal scene, influenced policing and legal plan, inspired cultural representation, and left lasting lessons for future generations. Their rise and fall show the delicate balance between power, faithfulness, and result, showing how a neighborhood gang can leave a history far beyond the streets they once controlled. The Westies are remembered as bold enforcers, clever planners, and imperfect humans whose choices brought both fear and interest. Their story is a proof of the complication of organized crime, the changing power of law in society, and the lasting human interest with a thin line between power and downfall. In every sense, the Westies remain a defining chapter in the history of New York City's Irish mob, shaping the city, its culture, and its understanding of crime for generations to come.